Hi everybody. Tonight, I invite you to sink gently into a tale that whispers from the darkened corners of history. A story not of battles fought on grand fields, nor of roaring cannons beneath stormy skies, but of hushed conversations, veiled intrigues, and shadows that lingered long after the drums of war had fallen silent. This is a story about what happened after the death of Napoleon Bonaparte. Not the simple closing of a chapter with a man's last breath. No, this tale winds deeper, into the murky plots that swirled like mist around his cold remains. Whispers of poison, hidden hands reaching across empires, desperate men plotting from behind gilded doors, and a Europe trembling on the cusp of a fragile peace. Tonight we begin the first step of our long journey, wandering softly through dim corridors and quiet gardens, listening to the quiet echo of forgotten plots. A journey into the dirtiest intrigues that wove themselves into the story of Napoleon's end. A tale to soothe you gently into sleep, yet leave your mind wondering at the shadowy depths of human ambition. Let us begin, slowly. The night of May 5th, 1821, settled heavily over the rocky island of St. Helena, lying distant and lonely amid the grey swell of the South Atlantic. The sun had fallen quietly behind a veil of clouds, casting the jagged outline of Longwood House into a hushed silhouette against the pale evening sky. The wind carried with it a faint tang of salt, mingling with the sense of damp earth and fading geraniums from the garden outside the Emperor's window. Inside, the world was shrinking to a single chamber, draped in the half-light of flickering candles and softened by the heavy hush of waiting men. There, upon a bed hung with faded silks, lay the man who had once strode the breadth of Europe like a colossus, Napoleon Bonaparte, now gaunt and worn, his face pale beneath the sheen of sweat, his dark hair matted against the pillow. His breathing came shallow, each rise and fall of his chest slower than the last. Around him hovered a gathering of men whose faces, though composed, were drawn tight with the gravity of the moment. Among them stood Count Montholon, faithful, or perhaps too faithful, aide and guardian of the Emperor's exile. His eyes, sharp and restless, darted often toward the decanter on the side table and the small glass from which Napoleon had last sipped. A little apart, the Corsican valet marchand waited with hands clasped, lips pressed tight, his gaze resting not on the Emperor, but on Montholon. A shadow flickered across his face, the quiet uncertainty of a man who wondered whether loyalty could survive against darker truths. As the candle flames danced against the dark wood of the walls, the room seemed thick with more than just the weight of impending death. It was as if the air itself whispered of secrets held too long, of words left unsaid, and of questions that none dared voice aloud. Napoleon stirred slightly, his lips parting in a faint murmur. The words, fragments of memory, perhaps, slipped into the hush, soft as the turning of pages in a forgotten book. Montholon leaned in, straining to catch the sounds, but they dissolved into the air before meaning could form. Outside, the wind rose gently, brushing against the window panes like the soft sigh of a distant sea. There was a strange peace in that room, not the peace of contentment, nor of fulfilled destiny, but the eerie stillness that sometimes lingers before the unravelling of a long-held secret. For those present knew, each in his heart, that Napoleon's death would not pass as a simple end. They knew, or perhaps feared, that a darker chapter was already unfurling, one that had begun long before the Emperor's last breath, and would whisper through history long after his bones lay in the tomb. Whispers had drifted across St. Helena for months, subtle as the shifting of tides. Rumours that the Emperor's illness was not of natural course. The persistent agony in his stomach, the vomiting, the slow wasting of his once indomitable strength, all traced with too fine a resemblance to the symptoms of slow poisoning. But who would dare? Who would have the reach, the motive, the means to end Napoleon Bonaparte by stealth upon this lonely rock, watched over by British soldiers and distant from the courts of Europe? The answer perhaps did not lie in a single hand. Perhaps, like the shifting pieces of a chessboard, several hands had moved, each believing they played alone, each weaving their silent thread into a tapestry of death. Some looked toward the British governor, Hudson Lowe, a man of stiff manner and brittle pride, whose animosity toward the Emperor was well known. Lowe's restrictions had grown crueler with each passing month, his paranoia sharper, his gaze ever watchful. Did the governor fear that even in exile, Napoleon's shadow could rise again to haunt Europe? Others whispered of Montholon himself, the count whose devotion masked too many questions. His sudden wealth after exile, his strange absences, the odd taste of certain wines pressed upon the emperor, all folded quietly into a story that some would later tell in darkened parlours and quiet libraries, far from the eyes of the law. And then there were those who suspected the hand of distant powers, the Bourbons, restored uneasily to the French throne, who trembled at the name of Bonaparte even in exile. Or perhaps agents of Austria, whose Emperor Napoleon had once called father-in-law, and whose fragile peace hung by the slenderest thread. So many hands, so many motives, like shadows in the dim corridors of power, whispering against one another, weaving and unweaving plots no man could fully trace. But on that quiet evening, none of these murmurs passed the lips of the men at Longwood House. They stood in solemn vigil, their faces masks of grief and duty, even as their hearts shuddered beneath the weight of silent questions. And as the night deepened, and the faint thrum of the sea whispered its ancient song beyond the walls, Napoleon Bonaparte slipped quietly beyond the reach of his watchers. His chest fell once, rose faintly, and did not rise again. A silence deeper than the hush of death settled over the chamber. Yet outside those walls, the first dark ripples of suspicion were already stirring. Small, silent waves that would soon surge across the courts and coffee-houses of Europe. And thus, our tale begins. In the grey hush of dawn, a fine mist hung over the jagged slopes of St. Helena, curling around the volcanic crags and creeping gently across the wind-stirred grasses. The sky was a soft, muted silver, its edges brushed faintly with the pale blush of morning. But within the walls of Longwood House, the air remained thick, unmoved by the coming day. Word of Napoleon's passing did not rush out in a flurry, nor did it echo swiftly through the corridors of the British garrison. Rather, it unfolded with a strange, deliberate slowness, a creeping awareness that spread among the house's staff, each face turning pale, each whisper exchanged with downcast eyes. Dr. Francesco Antomarchi, the Corsican physician summoned in the final months of the emperor's suffering, remained by the side of the still figure, his expression etched with the worn lines of exhaustion. Yet behind his fatigue, an unspoken question burned. He had been brought to St. Helena under the emperor's own wishes, a physician of reputation, but also a man familiar with the old ways of Corsican loyalty. Though he had attended Napoleon faithfully, Antomarchi's heart harboured silent doubts that had deepened with each strange turn of the illness. It was not the ulcer he had suspected, nor the simple decay of an ageing body. The symptoms had shifted too subtly, too unnaturally, with odd moments of clarity amid relentless decline. The colour of the vomit, tinged at times with an unusual darkness, gnawed at the edge of his medical certainty. As the stillness of the chamber lingered, Montholon approached the doctor quietly, his step soft upon the worn wooden floor. His face bore a mask of composed grief, yet something in his eyes remained sharp, not mournful, nor even watchful, but calculating. "Doctor," he murmured, voice low, "it is finished." Antomarchi nodded once, his gaze lowering to the lifeless face upon the pillow. "Yes," he replied, his voice equally hushed, "it is finished." But even as the words left his lips, a bitter taste settled at the back of his throat, the taste of knowing that some stories do not end with a man's final breath. Some begin anew in the silence that follows. There would be an autopsy, Montholon insisted, a procedure to satisfy the inquiries of the British and the demands of history, and Antomarchi, bound by both duty and suspicion, would conduct it with his own hands. The room was prepared the following morning. Curtains drawn, lamps lit, the body of Napoleon laid upon a table draped in fine linen. The air held the mingled scent of wax and the faint tang of formalin, a cruel contrast to the soft chirring of birds beyond the shuttered windows. Among those present stood Montholon, Marchand, and a selection of British officers, their expressions carved in stone. None spoke much. Even Lowe himself, the governor, entered briefly, his eyes narrowing as they passed over the still form before him, as though searching for a final proof of his enemy's fall. The knife in Antomarchi's hand trembled, though not from fear. It was the tremor of a man balanced on the edge of certainty and doubt, the razor's edge between truth and the shadows that men weave in its place. The incision was made with careful precision, the skin parting beneath the keen blade, pale against the darker shadows within. The stomach, when examined, revealed a troubling sight. Lesions, unusual thickening of the walls, and a strange marbling that did not match the common ulcers of disease. Montholon leaned closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You see," he murmured, "it is as we thought. Cancer of the stomach. A tragic inheritance." Antamaki did not reply. He simply continued his work, though in his heart the threads of suspicion pulled tighter. The lesions spoke of chronic damage, yet the patterns seemed oddly inconsistent. And worse, when he examined the inner lining, he found strange discolorations, patches that defied the known progressions of cancer. Yet what was he to say in this room of silent witnesses, with Montholon's quiet voice a constant presence at his side? In the quiet days that followed, whispers of the autopsy's findings drifted like smoke through St. Helena. The official report, signed by Antamaki, Montholon and the attending British officers, confirmed death by stomach cancer, a fate that, though tragic, seemed to settle gently into the expectations of a Europe eager for closure. But among the servants, the guards, and those who had stood watch at Longwood, murmurs persisted. They spoke of Montholon's insistence on certain medications, the peculiar flavour noted in the Emperor's wine, and the faint scent that lingered in his chamber after certain visits. Some recalled the words of Cipriani, the Corsican servant who had died unexpectedly years before, a death so sudden, so quietly dismissed, that it now echoed like a dark prelude to the Emperor's own fate. Had Cipriani known too much, or had he merely stood too close to the shadows? In France, the story travelled more swiftly than any wind. Across salons in Paris, in whispered gatherings beneath the Bourbon court's watchful eyes, and within the shaded halls of exiled Bonapartists, questions flared like embers on dry tinder. Was it truly cancer, the silent killer that had claimed the father before the son? Or had a subtler, more deliberate hand guided the Emperor's descent into death? Montholon, upon his return to Europe, found himself a man of sudden wealth, his fortunes curiously restored, his debts quietly settled. His accounts swelled with funds from unnamed sources, while whispers of a pension drawn not from the Emperor's estate, but from far older European coffers, grew louder in the corridors of Parisian gossip. Antamaki, though hailed in public as a faithful physician, bore the weight of silent suspicion. His name, forever tied to the death mask of Napoleon, that eerie visage cast from the Emperor's face, became a token carried by both mourners and conspirators alike. And beneath it all, a question echoed in the hearts of those who remembered the Emperor not as a fallen despot, but as a man exiled by the fears of Europe. Did he die by the hand of fate, or by the hand of men who feared what he might yet become, even in chains? As the quiet weeks rolled on, and St. Helena's mist settled once more over Longwood's empty halls, the truth remained shrouded. A death certificate could be signed, a tomb could be sealed, but suspicion has no grave. The days following the Emperor's death settled over St. Helena with a strange, watchful quiet. The mourners moved like shadows through the narrow halls of Longwood House, their steps hushed, their eyes often turned inward. The island, a lonely outpost already steeped in the echoes of exile, seemed to slip into an uneasy sleep. Yet beneath this veil of calm, a different current stirred, the faint, relentless murmur of suspicion that would not rest. Marchand, the loyal valet, walked each morning along the narrow path behind Longwood, where the grasses bent softly beneath the breeze, and the black volcanic stones shone faintly with dew. His heart ached with a grief that was heavier than mere loss. It was a grief weighted with doubt, with memories that would not leave him. He remembered too clearly the strange silences between Montholon and the governor's messengers, the glances exchanged across the Emperor's sickbed, the carefully veiled tones when certain bottles arrived from the storerooms. He recalled, too, the bitter taste that sometimes touched Napoleon's lips after sipping the cordial that Montholon pressed upon him with gentle insistence. A loyal servant sees much and says little. But now, with the Emperor gone and his shadow lingering in the empty corridors, Marchand wondered if his silence had been a silent crime. On one such morning, as he traced the edge of the gardens, he found himself face to face with Antamaki. The doctor stood quietly by the low stone wall, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes gazing out toward the sea, where the pale horizon met the soft roll of waves. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind stirred the hem of the doctor's coat, lifting it gently like a soft exhale from the earth itself. At last, Antommarchi turned his head slightly, his voice low yet clear. "You wonder as I do," he said quietly. "What was truly in that glass?" Marchand did not deny it, he simply gave a slow, silent nod. Antommarchi's gaze returned to the sea, his features composed, but his voice carrying the faint tremor of a man wrestling with a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. "I have seen the symptoms of cancer," he continued softly. "I have seen its course, its cruel, relentless march. This," he paused, his brow furrowing, "this was something else, something slower, subtler, shaped not by nature, but by a hand with dark purpose." Marchand's throat tightened. The wind whispered through the garden's slender trees, their leaves trembling faintly against the grey sky. "Who?" Marchand's voice broke softly into the stillness. "Who would dare such a thing?" Antommarchi gave no answer. Perhaps none was needed, for in the quiet hours of the days that followed, their unspoken fears began to take darker shape. A strange rumour reached them. A whisper from a clerk in the British garrison passed furtively between hands until it came, soft as falling ash, to Longwood. A shipment of arsenic, it was said, had been brought quietly onto the island in the months before the Emperor's death. Officially, it was listed among the supplies. Pest control, they said, a measure against the creeping vermin that infested the old buildings of Longwood. But the quantity had raised more than one brow among the garrison's quieter voices. And then there was the matter of the wallpaper. Longwood House, its walls damp with the island's endless humidity, had been papered with a fine green design shipped years before from Europe. A wallpaper laced, as fashion then dictated, with arsenic-based dyes. It was known among some physicians that such wallpaper under damp conditions could release deadly vapours. Had this been known? Had it been allowed? Or worse, had it been planned? Antommarchi examined the remnants of the wallpaper with a quiet, methodical care. In the soft light of the Emperor's former study, he scraped samples, tested them with the crude reagents available on the island. The results, though far from the standards of European laboratories, left him cold. Arsenic. He said nothing at first, but his silence spoke volumes to Marchand, who watched him with growing unease. And when at last Antommarchi folded the small packet of samples into a linen cloth and tucked it into his case, a silent understanding passed between them. This was no longer mere suspicion. It was the faint, dreadful outline of a truth neither dared voice. But suspicion is a fire that burns beyond its origin. Even as Antommarchi and Marchand wrestled with the dark weight of their private discoveries, the court of Hudson Lowe began to hear faint echoes of a different kind. From the mouths of British officers, passed in cautious tones during quiet dinners and stiff gatherings, came murmurs that perhaps, just perhaps, the Emperor's death had been a mercy. Lowe, they said, had found himself at odds with London over the management of the exile. His strict measures, his endless reports detailing imagined conspiracies, had begun to wear thin on the patience of his superiors. Napoleon alive had been a burden of watchfulness, a magnet for spies, a weight upon the conscience of an empire trying to mend its peace. But dead, the Emperor was a problem solved. Lowe himself gave no public word. He remained, as always, a man of rigid formality and brittle pride. Yet those who knew him spoke of a peculiar lightness in his manner in the days after the Emperor's passing, a faint lifting of the invisible yoke that had pressed upon him since Napoleon first set foot on St. Helena's soil. And in London, too, the whispers grew. A quiet letter, unsigned but traced by those with keen eyes to a high place in the government, spoke of the Emperor's passing as a fortunate conclusion to an inconvenient situation. It was a phrase that would echo in time across the drawing rooms of Europe. Fortunate conclusion. Even the Bourbons, restored uneasily to France's throne, received the news with a soft, private relief. They issued the expected proclamations of mourning, ordered the customary masses for the soul of the fallen emperor. Yet behind closed doors, their ministers toasted in quiet satisfaction. One danger, at least, had passed from their path. But even as the powers of Europe breathed their silent sighs of relief, a darker truth remained coiled beneath the surface. For suspicion, once born, is a serpent that does not sleep. The morning fog drifted low over the hills of St. Helena, settling like a silvery shroud upon the rough earth. Along the winding roads that led to Longwood House, the wheels of supply carts creaked softly, their drivers silent beneath the weight of a growing unease that no one dared name aloud. Inside Longwood, the chamber where Napoleon had drawn his last breath was now empty, save for the faint scent of extinguished candles and the fading echoes of whispered prayers. The Emperor's body lay in repose in an adjoining room, wrapped in fine linens, his features still and pale beneath a thin veil of silk. Yet in the corridors beyond, a quiet war of glances and murmured words began to ripple among those who had called themselves his companions in exile. Count Montholon moved through the house with the measured steps of a man both mourning and watching. His voice remained soft, his words chosen with the utmost care. Yet beneath his polished grief lay something harder, an unspoken assertion of control over the legacy left behind. He was, after all, the executor of the Emperor's will, the custodian of his final words, the bearer of secrets that could shift the winds of Europe if ever they were spoken aloud. But shadows clung tightly to Montholon's reputation, and though no accusation had yet passed openly from mouth to mouth, a lingering question gnawed quietly at the edges of every hushed conversation. Was the Count's loyalty born of devotion or of darker purpose? The will, read in hushed tones within the drawing room, left little doubt as to the trust Napoleon had placed in him. Vast sums, titles, tokens of affection, all noted in Montholon's favour, all sealed with the hand of a man now silent beneath the veil of death. Yet to Marchand and Antommarchi, the names and figures inked upon those pages echoed strangely against the recent whispers of poison and plots. One evening, as a soft rain tapped against the shutters, Marchand stood with Antommarchi in the quiet of the former study, the place where Napoleon himself had once dictated letters, his voice steady even as his health faded. Marchand's gaze fell upon a small ledger left upon the desk, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He opened it gently, revealing the tight, precise script of the Emperor's hand. Notes, figures, reflections, and among them, a curious line penned scarcely a month before his death. Beware those who serve with smiling lips and poisoned hands. The words hung in the air like a faint whisper from beyond the veil. Antommarchi read them in silence, his brow tightening slightly. Perhaps, he murmured at last, the Emperor saw more than we believed. But suspicion, though sharp, remained a silent guest within the walls of Longwood. No open accusation crossed the lips of the surviving companions. The weight of imperial memory, the fear of scandal, and the shadow of powerful enemies beyond the seas held their tongues in a careful, uneasy truce. Yet beyond St. Helena, the seeds of darker tales began to root themselves in the soil of Europe's restless imagination. In London, the whispers passed swiftly through the salons of the politically curious. A certain Lord Holland, known for his sympathetic views toward the fallen emperor, received private word from an officer returning from the island. The message, though vague, stirred the embers of a rumour that would refuse to die. The officer spoke of a curious pattern, of Montholon's frequent attendance upon Napoleon during his final decline, of his peculiar insistence on overseeing the preparation of certain beverages, and of his unusually close dealings with Governor Hudson Lowe. Lord Holland, though careful with his words, shared these shadows with his circle, and from that moment the whispers grew. Across the English Channel, in the cafes of Paris, former Bonapartists and sympathisers gathered in quiet corners, their conversations laced with guarded tones and furtive glances. One name surfaced with troubling regularity: Montholon, the man who had gained most from the Emperor's final will. The man whose debts had vanished as quietly as Napoleon's strength. The man whose return to Europe was marked by a curious increase in both wealth and influence. And yet, no proof. Only shadows, only whispers. But shadows cast long reflections upon the restless minds of men. In Vienna, amid the polished halls of the Austrian court, Metternich himself, the great architect of Europe's fragile peace, listened quietly as reports filtered in from his network of agents. He, too, heard the murmurs of foul play. He, too, considered the possibility that the death of the Corsican had been no natural passing, but a quiet execution masked beneath the veil of disease. And for a moment, brief, fleeting, even Metternich wondered whether the hand that had ended Napoleon's life belonged to an ally or to a rival. For if Montholon had acted, had he done so with British blessing? Or had another power moved in silent calculation, seeking to remove a threat that even in chains could disturb the order of a trembling continent? Questions all, but questions with sharp edges. Meanwhile, on St. Helena, Governor Hudson Lowe continued his meticulous reports to London, his words clipped and careful, his tone as coldly correct as ever. Yet within his private correspondence a curious note appeared. He spoke in passing of the Emperor's declining health, and of his own relief at the conclusion of what he termed an uncomfortable responsibility. An uncomfortable responsibility. The phrase lingered in the minds of those who read it. Was it merely the weary sigh of a man tasked with a difficult duty, or a subtle admission of a burden quietly lifted by another's hand? No one could say. But the truth, whatever it might have been, now lay sealed in a grave beneath the rocky soil of St. Helena. And the questions had only just begun their long, slow march across the restless hearts of men. The burial of Napoleon Bonaparte took place beneath a sky veiled in muted grey, the clouds hanging low like draped mourning cloth across the rugged horizon of St. Helena. The procession moved slowly, each step echoing with a gravity that seemed to settle upon the very ground itself. Soldiers in solemn ranks, officers with swords drawn in silent salute, and a small cluster of mourners, companions, servants, and those whose loyalty remained unspoken even in the face of death. Marchand walked among them, his eyes fixed upon the simple coffin borne on the shoulders of the Emperor's remaining household. The wood, though plain, bore the weight of more than a man's remains. It carried the silent legacy of an empire, the echo of a name that had shaken thrones and redrawn the maps of Europe. And as the slow march wound its way toward the chosen resting place, a quiet valley shaded by willow trees in the heart of the island, a hush deeper than mere ceremony settled over the company. The grave, freshly cut into the rocky earth, yawned open like a silent question. No imperial fanfare, no banners, only the soft murmur of prayer and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the morning breeze. Antommarchi stood near the foot of the grave, his face pale beneath the weight of his silent doubts. Beside him, Count Montholon kept a composed vigil, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The words of the burial rite flowed softly into the air, mingling with the quiet sigh of the wind. Yet for many present, the solemnity of the ceremony did little to ease the gnawing unease that clung to their hearts. For even as the earth fell softly upon the coffin's lid, suspicion whispered louder than the prayers. And it was not only the living who watched that day. Unseen, the currents of rumour and quiet inquiry had begun to spread their reach beyond the shores of St. Helena. Letters, half-coded and delicately phrased, crossed the seas toward Europe. Reports filtered into the private archives of intelligence circles in London, Paris, Vienna, and even distant Petersburg. Among those who received such whispers was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the Prince of Benevento, the arch-survivor of Europe's turbulent years. Though he had turned his back on the Bonapartist cause, Talleyrand was a man who understood too well the language of secret plots and the quiet economy of betrayal. In his Paris salon, draped in soft candlelight and perfumed with the scent of rare cigars, Talleyrand listened as a trusted emissary delivered a quiet account, the first of many, of the strange circumstances surrounding the Emperor's death. He said little. Only a faint smile touched his lips, the smile of a man to whom intrigue was as natural as breathing. "The Emperor," he murmured softly, "has fallen victim to the most ancient of empires, human fear." Yet even Talleyrand, with all his subtle knowledge, could not have guessed how far the roots of suspicion would reach. In London, the matter took on a darker tone. A private memorandum circulated among members of the Foreign Office, marked with the discreet stamp of private and confidential. It spoke in guarded phrases of the relief felt at the Emperor's passing, and of the necessity to maintain a careful watch upon the narratives emerging from St. Helena. Publicly, the British government mourned. Official notices, statements of solemn regret and gestures of respect for the fallen foe were dispatched with the precision of a carefully tuned orchestra. But behind closed doors, a different sentiment stirred. For to some within the heart of London's power, Napoleon's death was not a matter of simple conclusion. It was a question of management, of shaping the legacy of a man who had refused to die quietly, even in exile. Among these shadowed circles, a plan began to take shape. To control the story was to control the memory, and so, quietly, officials began to steer the flow of information. Select reports from St. Helena were emphasized. The findings of the autopsy, with their careful phrasing regarding cancer, were published with subtle reinforcement in London's leading journals. Medical authorities were consulted, men of good standing, whose opinions could lend weight to the official narrative. The word cancer became not only a diagnosis, but a shield against suspicion. And in the salons of London, as in the cafes of Paris, the echo grew, soft at first, then firmer with each passing week. A natural death, a hereditary affliction, a fate sealed by blood, not by poison. Yet for every voice that echoed this refrain, another whispered in darker corners. In a quiet street of Paris, within the back room of a modest printing house, a pamphlet passed from hand to hand. Its pages unsigned, hinted at foul play. It spoke of a plot, of hands unseen, working under the cover of exile. The pamphlet asked questions no official report could answer. Why had Montholon's fortunes risen so suddenly? Why had Hudson Lowe's private correspondence been so guarded in its phrasing? And why, above all, had Antommarchi himself remained so silent, his findings spoken only in tones of uncertainty? The pamphlet bore no author's name. It bore only a single line upon its cover: "Justice for the Emperor." It spread, quietly at first, among Bonapartist sympathizers, soldiers of the old guard, and those who had once marched beneath the eagle standard. And with it, the ember of suspicion flared into a slow-burning fire. Across the cities of Europe, the death of Napoleon ceased to be a closed chapter. It became a question, a mystery clothed in veils of doubt and whispered treachery. A question that would echo through the hearts of men long after the last shovelful of earth fell upon the emperor's grave. And as the days of mourning faded into memory, one truth remained as certain as the dark soil of St. Helena itself. The story of Napoleon's death had only begun. In the quiet weeks that followed the emperor's burial, St. Helena fell into a strange rhythm of silence and subdued routine. The ships that came and went from its isolated harbour carried little more than provisions, official dispatches, and letters bound for distant shores. Yet among these letters, penned by careful hands and sealed with cautious discretion, flowed the first dark currents of a story that would ripple across continents. Marchand remained at Longwood, tending to the lingering affairs of the emperor's household. His duties, once dictated by the sharp voice of a living master, were now governed by the soft echoes of memory. Each task, from the cataloguing of Napoleon's belongings to the management of his surviving correspondence, became a ritual touched with sorrow and an ever-deepening unease. It was during one such morning, as the grey light of dawn cast soft shadows upon the study walls, that Marchand came across a sealed packet resting among the emperor's personal effects. The handwriting upon it was unmistakable, the sharp, deliberate script of Napoleon himself, to be opened only in the event of my death. Marchand's hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet within. The letter was brief, its tone calm, its words carrying the quiet weight of a man accustomed to confronting both fate and treachery. Should I succumb before the natural course of my life, know that not all deaths are born of illness. Trust no man whose loyalty demands reward, nor any hand that serves both friend and foe. The words settled into Marchand's heart like a stone dropped into still water. He folded the letter with care and placed it within his own personal effects, the knowledge of its contents burning quietly in his thoughts. Yet even as Marchand wrestled with his silent burden, the broader web of suspicion began to tighten beyond the shores of St. Helena. In London, a curious figure emerged amid the whispers that now circled the salons and private clubs: Barry Edward O'Meara, the former personal physician to Napoleon during his early exile. O'Meara, dismissed by Hudson Lowe years before for his perceived sympathies toward the emperor, had returned to England a man with many grievances, and perhaps even more secrets. His accounts of Napoleon's treatment under Lowe had already stirred discomfort among the political elite. But now, in quiet conversations and carefully worded letters, O'Meara began to hint at something darker. He spoke of the relentless restrictions imposed upon Napoleon, the deliberate isolation, the psychological pressure, a slow strangulation, he suggested, designed to break a man without overt violence. And when pressed, he spoke, in tones soft enough to remain just above a whisper, of the possibility that Napoleon's death had been not merely allowed, but orchestrated. O'Meara stopped short of naming names. Yet his carefully placed doubts added fuel to a fire that flickered within the heart of London society. And soon, the pamphlets began. Printed in discreet batches, circulated through networks of sympathizers and political dissenters, they bore titles designed to stir both curiosity and unease. The Emperor poisoned. The St. Helena conspiracy. Did Europe fear his return? They spoke of arsenic, of treachery, of the silent complicity of powers who dared not face the risk of Napoleon alive, even in chains. Some pamphlets went further, accusing Hudson Lowe by name, hinting darkly at a plot sanctioned by unseen hands within the British government. Others focused their suspicion upon Count Montholon, painting him as a Judas figure. The friend whose loyalty masked a deeper betrayal, whose newfound wealth spoke of darker bargains struck in the shadows of exile. The British authorities responded with predictable swiftness. Public statements were issued, denouncing the pamphlets as the work of agitators and political malcontents. The official narrative, death by stomach cancer, was reinforced with medical opinions from London's most esteemed physicians. Yet despite these efforts, the whispers refused to die. If anything, they grew. In France, the Bonapartist underground seized upon the narrative of foul play with eager fervour. For them, it offered a new martyrdom, a fresh wound upon which to build the memory of the fallen emperor. The cry of Napoleon murdered echoed not only in the darkened corridors of secret societies, but even among the quiet mutterings of the common people. In taverns, in marketplaces, in the shadowed alcoves of Paris's narrow streets, the story spread. And with it, a dangerous sense of unfinished justice. For among those who still clung to the dream of the empire, soldiers of the old guard, loyalists driven underground, families whose fortunes had risen and fallen with Napoleon's star, the thought that their emperor had been murdered stirred something deeper than mere grief. It stirred anger. And anger, like suspicion, is a fire that spreads swiftly. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Metternich observed these developments with a careful eye. He understood, perhaps better than any other man in Europe, the delicate balance of power that rested upon the emperor's grave. If the suspicion of foul play grew unchecked, it could reignite the smouldering embers of Bonapartist loyalty. It could fracture the fragile peace he had so painstakingly crafted at the Congress of Vienna. And so, through discreet channels, Metternich lent his silent support to efforts aimed at controlling the narrative, encouraging loyal newspapers and discreet agents to reinforce the official version of events. But even Metternich, with all his web of influence, knew he could not silence the darker murmurs entirely. For suspicion had become a living thing. It moved beyond the grasp of kings and ministers. It lived in the hearts of men, whispered in alleys, debated in smoky salons, passed from hand to hand in ink-stained pamphlets carried across borders by restless hearts and loyal hands. And in St. Helena, where the emperor's tomb lay beneath its silent canopy of trees, Marchand stood often at the grave's edge, the letter from Napoleon a constant weight against his heart. There, in the soft rustle of the willows and the endless murmur of the distant sea, he found no peace, only the haunting echo of his master's final, unspoken warning. Trust no man. And as the wind stirred gently across the emperor's resting place, it seemed to Marchand's restless heart that suspicion itself whispered among the leaves, a quiet voice promising that the story was far from over. Far from the windswept cliffs of St. Helena, in the gilded salons of Paris, the ghost of Napoleon Bonaparte stirred restlessly in the hearts of men. The emperor's body lay silent beneath the willows of a lonely island, yet his shadow seemed to lengthen over Europe with every passing day. The year after his death brought a quiet unease that clung tightly to both court and commoner. The Bourbon monarchy, restored by the will of allied powers, sat upon a throne that felt brittle beneath the weight of whispered doubts. King Louis XVIII, his health failing and his popularity thinner than the paper of his proclamations, understood all too well the danger of memory and of a martyr. In private, the ministers of the Bourbon court discussed the Napoleon question with a mix of nervousness and cold calculation. It was the Comte d'Artois, the king's brother and heir presumptive, who voiced the thoughts many dared not speak. "We have cut off the head," he said during a hushed council, his voice low, but the shadow remains. And indeed the shadow moved with unsettling persistence. In the cafes of the Latin Quarter, whispered conversations spoke of injustice and betrayal. Among students, artisans and old soldiers of the Grande Armée, the idea of Napoleon as a victim, not of fate but of murder, took deep and fervent root. The tale was too powerful, too darkly romantic, not to believe. The emperor, betrayed by those he trusted most, poisoned in exile, abandoned by the very powers who feared his name. It was a narrative that needed no embellishment. It burned with the raw anger of those who had seen the empire fall, whose fathers and brothers had marched behind the eagles only to watch France handed back to foreign kings. Pamphlets poured from hidden presses. Some bore lurid titles, "The Murder of Saint Helena," while others cloaked themselves in scholarly language, citing fragments of letters, witness statements, and carefully selected excerpts from medical reports. The cancer theory, despite its official sanction, began to unravel beneath the weight of popular suspicion. The story of arsenic, of the poisoned wallpaper, of Montholon's treachery, these fragments pieced together into a darker tapestry that spread like wildfire. The Bonapartist underground, fragmented yet far from extinguished, seized upon the tide of feeling with quiet efficiency. Agents moved among the people, distributing pamphlets, whispering of hidden truths, keeping alive the ember of loyalty to the imperial cause. And at the heart of this movement, though never openly declared, lay the unspoken question that haunted every whispered word. If Napoleon had been murdered, who had ordered it? The answers varied, each darker than the last. Some spoke of the British Crown, a silent execution carried out by agents of a government too fearful to allow even a captive emperor to live. Others accused the Bourbons, trembling on their fragile throne, of conspiring in secret with those entrusted to guard their greatest enemy. A few, darker still, hinted at a broader, more sinister alliance. A coalition of monarchs who, having crushed Napoleon on the field of battle, had come together one last time to ensure his death in exile. Yet amid these swirling currents of rumour, one name surfaced again and again with unnerving frequency. Charles Tristan, Marquis de Montholon, the faithful companion, the executor of the will, the ever-present shadow at the emperor's bedside. His sudden fortune, his quiet return to Paris, his subtle ascent within certain circles of influence, all became silent accusations, whispered beneath the breath of men who dared not speak louder. And in this rising tide of suspicion, even the Bonapartist faithful found themselves divided. For if Montholon had been the hand, whose command had he obeyed? Had he acted upon the orders of the Bourbons? The British? Or a darker thought still, had he acted alone, driven by greed, ambition, or the whispered promises of power from enemies cloaked in deeper shadows? Marchand, now back in France, moved like a man caught in a storm of ghosts. He received countless requests, some veiled, some direct, to speak publicly of his time on St. Helena, to confirm or deny the rumours, to offer some glimpse of the truth. Yet Marchand remained silent. Not out of fear nor of loyalty to any government, but out of a gnawing, relentless doubt that no answer could satisfy. He carried within his heart the letter Napoleon had penned in his final days, a letter that spoke not of enemies but of treachery masked as friendship. And in that letter, Marchand read a truth darker than any rumour. Napoleon himself had suspected, not of kings or governors, but of those within his own household. One evening, beneath the soft glow of a Parisian street lamp, Marchand met quietly with Antommarchi in a small café far from the grand boulevards. They sat in silence for a long while, the faint clatter of cups and muted conversation wrapping them in a fragile veil of normalcy. At last Marchand spoke, his voice barely more than a breath. He knew. Antommarchi met his gaze, his eyes dark and hollow. "I know." No further words passed between them that night, for what could they say? The truth, whatever it was, had been buried with the emperor. And yet, even buried, it seemed to rise again in every whisper, in every pamphlet passed from hand to hand, in every quiet conversation that ended with a glance over the shoulder. Europe's great powers tried to stifle the rumours with proclamations and silence. The Bourbons tightened their grip on Paris, issuing decrees against seditious publications. The British government issued carefully worded denials, dismissing the conspiracy as the idle fancy of the discontented. But neither law nor proclamation could silence a question once it had rooted itself in the heart of a people. Had Napoleon been murdered? And if so, how deep did the betrayal run? In the silence of that question lay the embers of a storm that no empire could fully contain. And as Paris slept beneath the soft wash of gaslight and the slow toll of midnight bells, the shadow of St. Helena stretched farther still. A shadow that whispered that the dead do not always sleep quietly in their graves. Autumn arrived quietly over the streets of Paris, its soft chill weaving through narrow alleys and across the worn cobblestones of the left bank. The chestnut trees lining the boulevards shed their first leaves, drifting down in slow spirals, as though nature itself moved in a hush of contemplation. Yet within the quiet heart of the city, a different storm gathered, not upon the winds, but within the restless murmur of its people. In the salons of Saint-Germain, where the nobility spoke in low tones behind velvet curtains, the whispers of Napoleon's death carried a new edge. It was no longer merely a curiosity of political gossip. It had become a spectre, a question that refused to die. The Bourbon monarchy, ever watchful of its fragile hold upon the throne, grew uneasy beneath the weight of rumours that no decree could silence. Ministers met behind closed doors, their conversations marked by a rising note of concern. Reports filtered in from the prefecture of police, pamphlets circulated in the working-class districts, veterans of the Grande Armée gathering in secret, Bonapartist emblems, the imperial B, the letter N, appearing chalked upon walls in the dead of night. The spectre of conspiracy, once dismissed as idle fancy, now pressed upon the conscience of the court. For it was not just the rabble that whispered of murder. Members of the aristocracy, men of letters, even a few within the military caste, began to murmur behind guarded hands. And as the autumn deepened, a curious event stirred the embers of suspicion into open flame. A book appeared, its cover plain, its title simple. Memoirs of Napoleon's Last Days on St. Helena by Barry Edward O'Meara. The former physician's account, carefully phrased yet sharp in its implications, sent a ripple through both London and Paris. Though O'Meara refrained from direct accusations, his narrative wove a tapestry of subtle hints. The Emperor's mysterious symptoms, the oppressive conduct of Governor Hudson Lowe, the strange conduct of certain members of Napoleon's entourage, and most damning of all, the suggestion that Napoleon had believed himself poisoned. The book sold swiftly. Copies passed hand to hand, moving from drawing rooms to cafes, from libraries to backroom gatherings of Bonapartist loyalists. The effect was immediate. In London, O'Meara's publication was met with both official condemnation and private fascination. The Foreign Office dismissed the memoirs as the sensational imaginings of a disgruntled former servant, yet behind the scenes, concern flickered. For the pamphlets of agitators were one thing, but the published word of a physician who had stood beside the Emperor carried a weight that no government decree could easily dislodge. In Paris, the reaction was sharper. The book fanned the flames of suspicion into open discourse. Bonapartist circles, emboldened by the sudden rush of public interest, moved with quiet resolve. Secret societies formed, groups bound not by formal oath but by shared memory and silent purpose. They gathered in cellars, in disused taverns, in the shadowed rooms of sympathetic patrons. Their aim was not yet rebellion. It was something quieter and perhaps more dangerous. They sought the truth. For within the whispered legends of betrayal lay a weapon of immeasurable power, the martyrdom of an emperor. If it could be proven, or even widely believed, that Napoleon had been murdered by his enemies, his memory would transform from the symbol of a fallen empire into the banner of an unfinished cause. And beneath the surface of this quiet movement stirred a figure both familiar and unexpected. Joseph Bonaparte, the elder brother of Napoleon, former King of Spain and Naples, moved quietly from his exile in America back toward the shadows of European politics. Though Joseph had long been dismissed as a man of lesser ambition and softer character, reports whispered of discreet meetings held in the neutral cities of Switzerland and northern Italy. There, emissaries of former imperial officers met with Joseph's envoys, their conversations marked by a shared hunger for truth, or perhaps for justice. Even in Vienna, Metternich's agents took note. Dispatches crossed his desk, detailing gatherings in Geneva, in Milan, in Laon, gatherings cloaked in the guise of private assemblies, yet seeded with men whose names stirred unease in royal courts. Men of the old guard, men who had once marched behind the eagle, men for whom the idea of Napoleon as a murdered sovereign was more than mere rumour. It was a call. Metternich, ever the master of balance, responded with his customary subtlety. He dispatched trusted operatives to monitor, to report, to infiltrate where possible. But above all, he sought to understand whether this movement was born of genuine outrage or of something darker, a rekindled flame of Bonapartist ambition. And in the quiet of his study, beneath the tall windows of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, Metternich considered a question that no statesman could ignore. Had Europe truly seen the last of Napoleon's legacy? Or had his death, shrouded in suspicion and whispered treachery, merely given birth to a legend more dangerous than any living emperor? In the dim streets of Paris, in the salons of London, in the embassies of Vienna, the question took on a life of its own. For even as kings and ministers moved their pawns upon the board of diplomacy, the game beneath, the darker, older game of rumour, suspicion and quiet fury, unfolded beyond their reach. And somewhere, in the restless heart of the people, a silent conviction stirred. If the emperor had been murdered, then perhaps his cause had never truly fallen. And beneath the quiet fall of autumn leaves, Europe waited, as though holding its breath for a truth that might yet rise from the grave. Winter crept upon Europe with a solemn, steady hand, casting its pale breath over the streets of Paris, the damp lanes of London, and the mist-draped alleys of Vienna. Fires flickered behind closed shutters, and the scent of damp wood smoke lingered in the air. Yet in the hearts of men, the embers of suspicion burned hotter than any hearth. In Paris, the question of Napoleon's death became more than whispered conjecture. It became a quiet obsession. The city, veiled in frost and shadow, pulsed with subdued unrest. Markets bustled, carriages rattled across frozen cobbles, and the noble families held their winter balls, yet beneath the surface lay a taut string of tension, stretched thinner with each passing day. The Bourbon monarchy, though outwardly calm, stirred uneasily in its silken chambers. Reports from the Ministry of Police told of strange gatherings, not of armed men but of thinkers, printers and former soldiers. People who spoke too softly of St. Helena, who passed among themselves copies of O'Meara's memoirs, annotated in the margins with ink and the bitter fire of indignation. It was said that in the cafes of Montmartre, ex-soldiers of the Imperial Guard met by candlelight. They spoke of Longwood, of Montholon, of the silent Governor Hudson Lowe, and of the arsenic-laced wallpaper whose poisons seeped into the Emperor's breath. But among them, one phrase began to rise with alarming regularity: justice for the Emperor. It appeared scrawled upon tavern walls, carved into wooden beams in the quiet corners of Paris's oldest quarters. And though no uprising stirred, the message weighed heavily upon the hearts of those who ruled. In a narrow townhouse off the Rue de Grenelle, a man long thought exiled from public life sat at a desk cluttered with reports, letters, and coded dispatches. Joseph Fouché, the former Minister of Police, the man whose shadow had fallen across every conspiracy of the revolutionary and Napoleonic years, had retreated into private life following the Restoration. Yet now, the whispers of Napoleon's death drew him back into the subtle corridors of influence. Fouché, master of secrets, read the reports with the cold precision that had made him feared and indispensable to both republics and empires, and he saw clearly what many dared not. This was no mere rumour. It was a movement waiting for a name. A martyr's death, a whisper of betrayal. These were the seeds of revolutions. And though Fouché had little love for the Bonapartist cause, he respected the dangerous power of public sentiment. One evening, as snow fell gently against the darkened glass of his study, Fouché received a quiet visitor, a former aide to Napoleon, a man whose name he would never record, whose face would fade into the shadows of history. They spoke softly, the conversation lasting less than an hour. Yet from that meeting, a single truth emerged, passing between them like a silent oath. The story of Napoleon's death would not remain buried. Whether born of fact, suspicion, or deliberate invention, it had become a force neither king nor minister could control. And in that quiet, snow-veiled night, Fouché understood what few yet dared admit. The Emperor's death had become a second life. In London, meanwhile, the walls of Whitehall echoed with a different unease. The publication of O'Mara's memoirs had stirred more than public curiosity. Members of Parliament began to raise cautious questions, not of conspiracy, but of honour. Had the British government, in its handling of Napoleon's exile, permitted conditions that bordered upon cruelty? Had Governor Hudson Lowe acted beyond the bounds of duty? The Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, received a steady stream of inquiries, many of them cloaked in diplomatic phrasing, but sharpened by private doubt. To Castlereagh, a man weary from years of delicate political balancing, the issue was an unwelcome ghost. The last thing Europe needed was a legend of martyrdom feeding the fires of Bonapartist resurgence, and yet every attempt to smother the rumours seemed only to fan their flame. A letter leaked, its source unknown, purportedly written by an officer stationed on St. Helena. It spoke of unusual behaviour among the Emperor's entourage, of mysterious absences by Montholon, and of supplies delivered under orders from Lowe without proper oversight. Though unsigned and impossible to verify, the letter struck a chord in the public imagination. It spread rapidly, copied by hand, passed between friends, whispered of in London's coffee houses. And with it came a question now louder, darker, and more insistent. Had Napoleon's death been an accident of circumstance, or the quiet execution of a man feared too greatly to be allowed to live? In Vienna, Metternich remained watchful. His agents tracked the movements of known Bonapartists, noting their meetings, tracing their correspondence. But even Metternich, the great weaver of Europe's fragile peace, began to sense a change he could neither direct nor prevent. For in every corner of Europe, the suspicion surrounding Napoleon's death took root not only among radicals or old soldiers, but among the people, the silent mass who carried within their hearts the memory of an age when France had stood proud and defiant. And so, as the snows of winter deepened, a strange paradox unfolded. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man, was gone, buried beneath the earth of St. Helena. But Napoleon, the idea, lived anew in whispers of betrayal, in suspicions wrapped in the dark cloth of conspiracy. An emperor might be defeated on the field of battle, but a murdered martyr could conquer hearts in a way no living man ever could. And in the flicker of candlelight across the cities of Europe, men and women gathered in hushed circles, speaking softly of Longwood, of arsenic, of betrayal. And with each telling, the story grew darker and far more dangerous. Night drew thick around the island of St. Helena, swaddling its jagged cliffs and wind-worn outposts in a veil of quiet darkness. The Atlantic's breath was slow and ceaseless, stirring the wild grass above Longwood House. Though years had passed since the Emperor's arrival on these remote shores, the air still clung to the weight of significance, of whispers, of schemes, of the slow erosion of greatness. Within Longwood, the candlelight dimmed. The long corridors groaned with the nightly contraction of old wood, and the scent of salt hung close to the stone. In a modest chamber, carved more by necessity than comfort, lay the fading Titan, Napoleon Bonaparte. His breath, though still steady, came softer now, each exhale like a step further into shadow. Those who watched over him were no longer merely loyalists or exiles, they were witnesses to the final flickers of a light once too blinding to behold directly. Yet as his mortal strength ebbed, not all hearts on St. Helena were moved by sorrow or reverence. In the back rooms and across distant salons, in whispered French and careful English, darker currents stirred. Back in the drawing rooms of Europe, particularly in Vienna and London, the powers who had once feared his return more than any pestilence were quietly threading plans together, contingencies wrapped in velvet and ink. Word of the Emperor's decline had reached them through cautiously coded letters, carried by ships under false manifest, through agents trained to know how to speak without ever being quoted. In these dispatches, two names returned time and again, Montholon and Lowe. Count Charles Tristan de Montholon, ostensibly the most loyal of Napoleon's companions in exile, remained ever at his side. He poured his drinks, transcribed his thoughts, and stood guard over the battered figure once feared by kings. And yet, the deeper one examined the shadows cast behind his devoted silhouette, the more twisted they seemed. His debts in France, his curious inheritance of favour after the fall of the Empire, and his continued ease with the British governor of the island had not gone unnoticed. Governor Sir Hudson Lowe, meanwhile, had become synonymous with bitterness and vigilance. He was a man who clutched duty so tightly it bled between his fingers. His instructions were clear. Ensure Napoleon did not escape, ensure he did not become a martyr, ensure he disappeared slowly, quietly, and without dignity. His control of correspondence, his insistence on surveillance, and his curious allowance of Montholon's complete access, while others were kept at a distance, drew skepticism even among his own officers. One such officer, a young lieutenant named Charles Rivington, had begun to keep a private journal, entries inked only after nightfall and hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Rivington, unlike his superiors, watched with an eye unclouded by politics or pride. He noted the oddities. The strange powders passed discreetly into the kitchen, the shifts in Napoleon's complexion, the pain that did not align with his known illnesses. He noted Montholon's night walks and the governor's sudden silences during morning briefings. On the 10th of March, 1821, Rivington wrote, "The Emperor is pale beyond the veil of sleep. He no longer takes broth without wincing. The Comte brings a new tincture, saying it soothes the liver, but it smells not of medicine, it stinks of almonds. A French cook named Cipriani died but weeks past, mysteriously, and none but the Comte mourned him. I do not trust the silences anymore." This scent, bitter almond, was known to those versed in the sciences and poisons of the age. It was the telltale aroma of arsenic, a compound feared and favoured alike for its slow, elusive malice. Invisible in wine, untraceable in decay, it was the poison of courtiers and whispering assassins, of plans enacted with patience rather than blades. Rivington's suspicions grew, and yet he remained powerless. A letter sent to a superior in London received no reply. He dared not confront the governor, nor risk open accusation against Montholon. So he wrote, he watched, and he prayed. Meanwhile, within Longwood, Napoleon's mind turned ever more inward. He dreamt of battlefields and orchards, of Paris streets and Corsican skies. He spoke of Josephine in his sleep and of eagles, and once, softly, he muttered the phrase, "Ils ne veulent pas que je revive." They do not want me to live again. The conspirators, or those suspected, never met in candlelit caverns or penned their plots in blood. Their work was more insidious. If there was indeed a plan, it was a plan of attrition, built on allowing illness to flourish, on offering no cure, or perhaps giving one drop too many of a particular remedy. It was a plan of gentle fading, made respectable through the illusion of care. On the 15th night of April, the Emperor refused food altogether. His voice was hoarse, his vision blurred, and his limbs trembled, not from cold but some deeper, chemical unease. The Comte said it was the climate. Lowe blamed melancholy. Rivington alone stared at a scrap of the Emperor's discarded dressing cloth, its edge faintly green where no dye had touched it. Time slowed. The Atlantic, ever watchful, whispered against the rocks below Longwood, as if bearing witness to the fall of a god. And still, no word left the island without scrutiny. No truth escaped unshackled. But the truth, like the tide, has a way of returning. And even in death, the Emperor's shadow began to reach forward, seeking a reckoning for the betrayal that now seemed nestled beside him, like a loyal servant waiting for the last breath. The night he began to whisper of poison, of betrayal, the candles burned lower than usual. No one answered his murmurs. No one denied them either. And above the island, the stars, so often obscured by mist, shone clearer than they had in months, as though looking upon a drama in its final, chilling act. Dawn rose heavy and slow upon St. Helena, its pale light creeping reluctantly over the hills and cliffs like a spectre uncertain of its welcome. The early breeze stirred the long grass outside Longwood House, yet within its walls a deeper chill remained, one untouched by the sun or the Atlantic wind. Napoleon Bonaparte lay upon his narrow bed, his breath shallow, his eyelids flickering with the slow struggle of a man tethered between two worlds. Around him, shadows moved in careful silence. The Comte de Montholon stood close, his hands folded behind his back, his face composed into a mask of studied sorrow. At the foot of the bed sat Dr. Francesco Antomarchi, the Corsican physician sent by Napoleon's family, scribbling notes with hands that trembled despite himself. It was Antomarchi who had been entrusted with the Emperor's care during these final months. Yet even he, a doctor of repute and no stranger to the maladies of the age, found himself bewildered by the strange constellation of symptoms that beset his illustrious patient. The constant burning pain in Napoleon's abdomen, the swelling of his legs, the pallor that deepened with each passing day, none of it seemed to follow a known pattern of natural decline. But when the physician raised cautious queries to Montholon, or hinted at seeking further counsel from the British surgeons stationed on the island, the answers came swiftly and coldly. "The Emperor trusts only his own," Montholon would say, with a smile that never touched his eyes. "We must not allow strangers, especially those loyal to Governor Lowe, near him. His enemies would see him weakened further." And so the circle around Napoleon grew tighter, the walls of his sick room closing in under the weight of false loyalty and hidden designs. Antomarchi remained, a prisoner of both his duty and his suspicions. In the town below, Lieutenant Ravington continued his silent watch. The young officer, though barred from Longwood's interior, often lingered near its grounds under the pretense of overseeing the regular patrols. He observed the comings and goings with an intensity sharpened by fear and a gnawing sense of helplessness. On a damp morning in late April, Rivington happened upon a servant boy, a wiry lad named Edward, carrying a bundle of linen discarded from the Emperor's chamber. The boy, unaware of Rivington's interest, hummed softly as he carried the soiled fabrics toward the refuse pit behind the kitchens. Something in the bundle caught Rivington's eye, a faint greenish stain along the cloth's edge, too unnatural for mere sickness or neglect. The memory of bitter almonds returned with a jolt, and the young lieutenant's heart pounded as he approached. "Edward," he called, careful to keep his voice light, "where do you take those?" The boy blinked, shifting the load in his arms. "To the refuse, sir. Comte's orders. No one's to keep anything from the sick room." Rivington nodded, stepping closer under the guise of casual interest. His gaze fixed on the cloth, noting its faint discoloration and the odd, almost metallic sheen that seemed to shimmer in the morning mist. He reached out, touching the edge briefly before drawing back, as though in idle curiosity. "Run along, then," he said softly. But his mind churned with silent fury. He needed proof, something undeniable. Yet even as he plotted how to obtain it, another more chilling thought dawned upon him. If this truly was the work of subtle poison, how long had it been happening? And how close was the Emperor now to the abyss? Back in the sick room, Napoleon stirred. His eyes opened slowly, two dark orbs clouded with pain yet alive with something deeper, a silent awareness, a sovereign's instinct honed through years of betrayal and war. He fixed his gaze upon Montholon, who had moved to adjust a curtain, casting a longer shadow across the dim chamber. "You watch me die," Napoleon murmured, his voice little more than a whisper, like a courtier waiting for a crown to fall. Montholon turned, a flash of surprise flickering across his composed face before smoothing into bland concern. "I watch you, sire," he replied gently, "so that you are never alone." But Napoleon's eyes did not soften, they narrowed, dark with meaning. "I have known men like you in every court I ever broke," he whispered, "and I know the weight of poison in a cup." The words hung in the air, sinking deep into the room's silence like a dagger pressed against the skin of a secret. Antomarchi froze in his writing. For a heartbeat, even the house seemed to still. Montholon, to his credit, did not flinch. He stepped forward and gently took the Emperor's wrist, checking the faint, fluttering pulse with practiced indifference. "You are fevered, sire," he murmured. "The fever speaks." Napoleon closed his eyes, a faint, bitter smile curling upon his lips. "Perhaps," he whispered, "but not all fevers lie." Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the withered hedges that lined Longwood's garden. In the distance, gulls circled in restless patterns over the sea. The island remained silent witness, its cliffs and moors holding within them the slow, suffocating march of death. Not the glorious death of a fallen general upon a battlefield, but the unseen, patient hand that worked in whispers and waited in shadows. By nightfall, the Emperor's strength faltered further. His skin grew clammy, his voice a hoarse rasp. Montholon remained close, Antommarchi pacing between the bed and the hearth, his heart laced with an unspoken terror. And still no word was sent to the outside. No alarm raised. Only the steady, silent conspiracy of indifference, veiled by the illusion of care. In the heart of St. Helena, as April slid into May, a dying emperor and a tightening circle of shadows moved steadily toward a moment no witness would ever forget, and no history would ever fully reveal. The first days of May arrived veiled in a soft, unyielding fog. It wrapped itself around the cliffs and hills of St. Helena, cloaking the island in a damp, oppressive hush. Even the seabirds flew lower, their cries subdued against the grey shroud of sky. The ocean, ever restless, lapped the shore with a hollow murmur, as though it too sensed the slow tightening of fate. Within Longwood House, the stillness became suffocating. The rooms that once echoed faintly with conversation or the scratch of Napoleon's pen now fell into a silence so profound it seemed to hum against the walls. The air inside his chamber grew stale with a mingling of dampness and the faint, sharp tang of medicinal tinctures. Napoleon lay unmoving, his eyes half-lidded, his breath shallow and erratic. The once proud contours of his face had hollowed, sharpened by the slow attrition of unseen hands. His skin bore a waxen hue, drawn tightly over high cheekbones once flush with vitality. Yet beneath the sheen of illness, something keener flickered in his gaze, an ember of awareness that refused to die. On this grim morning, a soft knock sounded at the door of the sick room. Montholon, ever vigilant at the Emperor's side, rose with his customary grace and answered. Behind the door stood Dr. Barry O'Meara, the Irish surgeon who had once tended to Napoleon before falling out of favour with Governor Lowe. O'Meara had been forbidden official contact, yet something had compelled him to attempt this last desperate visit. "I come not as a doctor of the British nor a man of war," O'Meara said quietly, "but as one who wishes to see him before it is too late." Montholon's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening upon the doorframe. For a long moment the air hung thick between them. Finally, with a small incline of his head, Montholon stepped aside. 10 minutes, he said softly. No more. O'Meara entered, the air of the sick room pressing against him like a weight. He approached the bed with measured steps, noting the frail figure upon it, the shallow rise and fall of the Emperor's chest, the distant gleam of recognition in dark, hollow eyes. "Your Majesty," he whispered. Napoleon's gaze shifted, focusing upon the familiar face. His lips moved, a faint whisper escaping. "O'Meara, they let you through the veil?" The Irishman nodded, kneeling by the bedside. He took the Emperor's hand, a hand now cool, the strength within it leached by the slow ravages of time and something darker. "I feared I would not see you again," O'Meara said softly. "I feared they would not allow it." A ghost of a smile touched Napoleon's lips. "They allow what serves them," he whispered. "Even my death must serve." O'Meara's heart clenched. He leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "Sire, there are rumours of powders, of draughts mixed in the wine, of treatments not meant to heal. I have tried to speak with those in London, but—" He faltered, eyes searching the Emperor's face. Napoleon's hand tightened faintly upon his. "I know," he murmured. "I have known for months, perhaps longer." O'Meara swallowed hard, dread chilling his blood. "Then why? Why permit them?" The Emperor's eyes closed briefly, as though even the weight of this conversation pressed too heavily upon him. When he spoke again, his voice was a slow murmur, like the soft turning of leaves in a dying breeze. "Because a slow death, unseen, leaves a louder echo than a martyr's blade. They wish me to vanish quietly, forgotten. I will not grant them that gift." O'Meara bowed his head, a sharp ache piercing his chest. "I wish there were more I could do." Napoleon turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting O'Meara's with a startling clarity. "You will," he said softly. "You will carry the truth when I no longer can." Behind them, Montholon shifted near the hearth, his eyes watching in silent calculation. O'Meara felt the weight of the Comte's gaze upon him, heavy with something between warning and disdain. Yet he held the Emperor's hand a moment longer before rising. As he turned to leave, Napoleon spoke once more, his voice so soft it barely carried beyond the bed. "They serve kings, you serve the truth. One of you will outlive the other." O'Meara left in silence, the door closing gently behind him. Outside, the fog thickened. Omera's heart pounded as he walked away from Longwood House, the Emperor's last words echoing within him. The weight of a hidden burden settled upon his shoulders, a burden of truth, of whispered suspicions, of silent crimes too carefully masked for the world to see. Inside the sick room, Montholon moved back to Napoleon's side, adjusting the thin covers with deliberate care. His expression remained composed, almost tender. "You tire yourself, sire," he murmured. "These visits, they cost you dearly." Napoleon's eyes remained closed. "More than you know," he whispered. As dusk fell upon St. Helena that evening, the storm clouds gathered low over the horizon. The wind rose, carrying with it a soft, mournful sigh that swept across the cliffs, over Longwood House, and into the darkening sea beyond. And within the dim chamber, beneath the watchful eyes of loyalty veiled in betrayal, the Emperor of the French slid one step closer to a fate no sword could have delivered more surely, a fate woven by silent hands in a plot darker than any battle's blood. The 5th day of May arrived, dark and relentless. A steady rain fell upon St. Helena, its soft percussion against Longwood's weathered roof marking the hours in a rhythm older than empires. In the grey hush of dawn, the world seemed to pause, as though the island itself were holding its breath. Inside the sick room, shadows pressed close. The only light came from a single, flickering candle set upon the bedside table, its flame trembling with each faint draught. The Emperor's breath, shallow and ragged, matched the wavering of the light. His once commanding presence had diminished to a frail outline beneath a mound of coarse linens, an emperor not fallen in battle nor struck down by the hand of fate, but slowly, methodically unravelled by silent forces. Montholon sat beside the bed, his posture immaculate, his face a mask of composed solemnity. He held a silver cup in his hands, a cup half filled with a dark, bitter draught meant, ostensibly, to ease the Emperor's pain. His fingers wrapped around it gently, the way a priest might cradle a chalice. Yet behind his steady gaze lingered something colder, something unreadable. Napoleon stirred faintly, his eyes flickering open. They seemed to struggle against an unseen weight, as if dragging themselves from a depth too dark for light. His lips moved, forming a word that came out as little more than a breath. "Josephine?" Montholon leaned forward, his voice a soft murmur. "Rest now, sire. You are among friends." But Napoleon's gaze remained distant, focused upon something or someone far beyond the room's dim walls. His hands shifted weakly, fingers twitching upon the coarse fabric. The effort seemed to drain what little strength remained in him. From the far corner of the room, Dr. Antommarchi observed in silence. The physician's eyes followed Montholon's every movement, a thin line of suspicion tightening across his brow. Days of silent vigil had worn upon the doctor, who had begun to see the subtle patterns woven into the routine, the precise moments when Montholon would offer a potion, the whispered reassurances that accompanied it, the way the Emperor's suffering seemed to deepen after each encounter. Yet here he remained, a man of science bound by duty, caught in a web he dared not disturb. As the storm outside intensified, the door opened softly, admitting a figure who entered with hesitant steps. It was General Henri Bertrand, the last of Napoleon's faithful officers on the island. Bertrand's face, normally marked with quiet resolve, now bore the weight of helpless sorrow. He approached the bed with slow reverence, bowing his head before speaking. "Sire, I have come." Napoleon's eyes shifted slowly toward him, recognition flickering faintly within them. A thin smile, ghostly and fleeting, touched the Emperor's lips. Henry, loyal to the end. Bertrand knelt beside the bed, taking the Emperor's hand gently in his own. The warmth had already begun to fade from those once strong fingers. Bertrand's voice trembled as he spoke. "I would not leave you, sire. Not now, not ever." From his seat, Montholon watched the exchange with careful neutrality. He placed the silver cup upon the small table, its surface gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Then, with a soft sigh, he rose and moved toward the hearth, tending to the fading embers with studied indifference. Bertrand leaned closer, his eyes searching Napoleon's face. "They have wronged you, sire. They sought to break you, but they never did." Napoleon's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, there was a distant gleam, a shadow of the iron will that had once bent Europe to his command. "They break the body," he whispered, "but the name endures." Bertrand bowed his head, a tear sliding quietly down his cheek. "It will, sire. I swear it." Across the room, Antamaki stepped closer, his heart tightening with a strange mix of dread and admiration. Even in this hollowed, dying frame, the essence of the Emperor, the fierce, unyielding spirit of Napoleon, burned with a defiance that neither illness nor betrayal could fully extinguish. For a long moment, the three men remained in silent vigil, Bertrand at the bedside, Antamaki standing watchful near the foot of the bed, and Montholon tending the fire with slow, deliberate care. Outside, the storm raged on. The day passed in a slow, mournful procession of whispered words and quiet footsteps. As evening fell, the candlelight deepened, casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. The Emperor drifted in and out of a restless sleep, his dreams veiled in murmurs of names and places now far beyond his reach: Austerlitz, Marengo, Josephine, Lodi, the echoes of an empire fading into the night. When the hour approached midnight, Montholon returned to the bedside. His movements were slow, his expression composed with a serenity that hovered just on the edge of something colder. He lifted the silver cup once more, bringing it gently to the Emperor's lips. "Just a sip, sire," he whispered, "to ease the pain." Napoleon's eyes opened slightly, fixing upon Montholon's face. A faint shadow of something, understanding, accusation, perhaps acceptance, passed between them. Then, with the ghost of a nod, he allowed the cup to touch his lips. The liquid passed into him with the slow, bitter burn of something darker than medicine. Beside the bed, Bertrand watched in silent anguish. Antamaki said nothing, though his fists clenched at his sides. The Emperor swallowed, closed his eyes, and exhaled a long, trembling breath. Outside, the storm broke upon the cliffs of St. Helena, and the waves roared into the night, echoing the slow, inevitable end of a man whose life had shaped the world, and whose death would remain cloaked in the silent treachery of whispered plots. The night of May 5th deepened into its quiet, mournful hours, each moment stretching with a fragile, aching stillness. Within Longwood House, time seemed suspended, held captive by the soft rasp of a fading breath and the quiet rustle of shadowed figures moving about a dying emperor's chamber. At the heart of this solemn vigil, Napoleon Bonaparte lay unmoving, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular motions. His face, once animated by the fierce light of command, now bore the still pallor of a man hovering at the threshold of mortality. The sharp planes of his features were softened by the dim glow of the candlelight, casting him in an almost spectral repose. By his side, Montholon remained seated, one hand resting lightly upon the edge of the bed, a silent sentinel cloaked in quiet attentiveness. His gaze never drifted far from the Emperor's face, yet behind those watchful eyes stirred a composure so complete it chilled even the flickering candle flames. At the foot of the bed, General Bertrand knelt with his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly as though in silent prayer. The weight of grief pressed upon him, but beneath it simmered a restless unease, an unspoken dread that twisted like a serpent within his heart. Though loyal to the last, Bertrand could not shake the subtle, gnawing suspicion that something darker lurked beneath the sombre quiet of the deathbed scene. Dr. Antamaki stood near the small table, his gaze fixed upon the silver cup Montholon had placed there hours before. He had examined it discreetly when Montholon's eyes were elsewhere, lifting it to his nose, searching for any trace of that bitter almond scent he had come to dread. But the faint metallic tang he detected was too subtle, too artfully masked to offer certainty. Yet certainty no longer mattered. The truth, however veiled, had woven itself into the air of that room, into the hushed tones, into the flickering shadows that seemed to recoil against the walls. A soft whisper escaped Napoleon's lips. Both Bertrand and Antamaki turned sharply toward him, their breath catching in the stillness. Montholon leaned closer, his expression smoothing into one of gentle concern. "Did you speak, sire?" he asked softly. Napoleon's eyelids fluttered, and his lips moved again, this time shaping words so faint they barely stirred the air. "France, my son." Bertrand reached for his hand, clasping it gently. "Your son will remember you, sire. All of France will." A faint tremor passed through Napoleon's fingers, and his eyes opened, dark and clouded, yet still reflecting a remnant of that indomitable will. He seemed to search the faces around him, lingering a moment longer upon Bertrand before shifting toward Antamaki and finally resting on Montholon. "Be careful of friends who bring the cup," he murmured, his voice trailing into a breathless hush. The words struck like a silent thunderclap. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Antomarchi's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing with the grim realization that even in his final hours, the Emperor understood more than those around him dared admit. Montholon gave no sign of reaction. He merely adjusted the linens across Napoleon's chest, his touch practiced and serene. "You are tired, sire. Rest now." But Napoleon's hand twitched faintly in Bertrand's grasp, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture that seemed more than mere weakness, a signal, a final warning. As the hours crept toward midnight, the storm outside broke into a relentless fury. Rain lashed the windows of Longwood, the wind shrieking against the walls like the wail of unseen sentinels. The sea pounded the distant cliffs, sending a dull, thunderous echo through the night. Within the chamber, the candle burned lower, its flame wavering like a soul caught between this world and the next. Bertrand rose slowly, casting a long, searching glance toward Montholon before turning to Antomarchi. "Doctor, will he last the night?" Antomarchi hesitated, words choking in his throat. He looked down upon the Emperor's still form, noting the drawn features, the bluish tinge beneath the eyes, the faint perspiration beading upon his temples. He forced a breath past the tight knot in his chest. "I do not believe so." Bertrand nodded solemnly, his face hardening with the weight of bitter acceptance. He turned once more to Napoleon, bowing his head deeply. "Forgive us," he whispered. "Forgive a world that could not bear your light." The Emperor made no reply. Montholon straightened in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the dying embers in the hearth. The soft crackle of the last fading coals mingled with the storm's distant roar. As midnight struck, the wind outside let out a mournful wail, a sound that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the Emperor's laboured breaths. And then, for a moment that stretched beyond time, the world within that small chamber held utterly still. Napoleon exhaled softly, his chest falling in a slow, final surrender. His eyes fluttered closed, not with the sharp snap of death, but with the quiet, inevitable fading of a star extinguished by shadow. The three men stood in silent vigil. No cries of grief, no wails of mourning disturbed the fragile peace of that hour. The Emperor of the French had passed beyond their reach, his legacy now untethered from his mortal shell. And yet, even in death, a question hung thick in the air, a question none dared speak aloud. Had the hand that guided him to this quiet grave been that of nature, or of silent betrayal? The storm outside gave no answer. It only raged on, sweeping across the cliffs of St. Helena, bearing with it the whispered echoes of a name the world would never forget, and a death the world would never fully understand. The morning of May 6th broke not with the triumphant blaze of sunrise, but beneath a sky heavy with grey clouds, casting St. Helena into a pallid, mournful light. The storm had spent its rage in the dark hours, leaving in its wake a strange, brooding stillness. The waves struck the cliffs below Longwood with a dull, rhythmic persistence, like a heartbeat muffled by distance. Within Longwood House, death's presence lingered like a dense fog, woven into the fabric of every room. The air felt heavier, the walls pressed closer. In the Emperor's chamber, the thin, lifeless form of Napoleon Bonaparte lay beneath a white shroud, his features obscured, his spirit fled to realms beyond the grasp of empires and betrayals alike. Around him, the world had not yet dared to stir. Bertrand remained near the bedside, standing motionless, his eyes fixed upon the shrouded figure. The lines of his face, hardened by years of war and exile, seemed drawn into an expression of silent, enduring grief. Yet within him, a different turmoil brewed, a storm of questions and dark certainties he could no longer suppress. Dr. Antomarchi stood nearby, his arms folded, his gaze distant as though staring beyond the walls of Longwood. His mind churned with the weight of all he had seen, the signs he had ignored, the truths whispered but never spoken aloud. The physician knew too well that this death bore the fingerprints of something colder than fate. Yet to speak would be to place his life, and perhaps the fragile memory of the Emperor, within the hands of those who had long conspired against both. Montholon moved with measured calmness around the chamber, giving quiet orders to the servants who arrived with solemn faces and lowered eyes. His voice remained low, his gestures precise, every movement cloaked in the careful veneer of devoted service. He instructed the coverings to be adjusted, the room to be aired, the floor to be cleaned. His was the composure of a man performing a sacred duty, yet in that composure lingered the faint, sour taste of rehearsed propriety. At the periphery of this dark tableau, a soft knock sounded at the chamber door. A servant entered hesitantly, eyes darting between the figures within before speaking in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "Sir Hudson Lowe is here." The words fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. Bertrand's jaw tightened. Antommarchi exchanged a brief, unreadable glance with him. Only Montholon displayed no visible reaction. He merely nodded once, his hands folded before him. "Show him in," he said quietly. The servant bowed and disappeared. Moments later, the British governor entered. Sir Hudson Lowe, a figure as cold and severe as the Atlantic itself, stepped into the chamber with deliberate, heavy strides. His uniform, immaculate as always, seemed at odds with the subdued air of mourning. His sharp eyes swept across the room before settling briefly on the shrouded form upon the bed. "I have come to offer my formal respects," Lowe intoned, his voice devoid of warmth, "and to ensure all proceedings are conducted appropriately." Bertrand's eyes darkened, a flicker of disdain passing over his features. "The Emperor has died, Governor. Your vigilance is no longer required." Lowe met Bertrand's gaze evenly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Dead men can still cause great disturbances in the living world, General. It is my duty to prevent that." A heavy silence settled between them. Antommarchi stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "His body has been tended to. We will arrange for an autopsy. For history. And for the honour of truth." Lowe's sharp gaze turned to the doctor. "Indeed, the British medical officers will, of course, be present." A faint smile touched Montholon's lips, one so fleeting it could have been imagined. He inclined his head slightly. "Of course, Governor. We have nothing to hide." The words hovered with a chilling ambiguity. Lowe gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning the faces before him, lingering upon Montholon for a breath longer than necessary. Then, without further comment, he turned and strode from the room, his boots echoing upon the wooden floorboards. As the door closed behind him, the tension within the chamber seemed to release, leaving in its wake a profound, suffocating dread. Bertrand exhaled slowly, his voice a low growl. Even in death, they fear him. Montholon's gaze lingered upon the door. They should. Antommarchi crossed his arms tighter across his chest, his mind racing. An autopsy. Would it reveal the slow, deliberate poisoning he suspected? Or would it be swept under the careful hands of those loyal to Lowe and the shadowed powers beyond? For a long moment, none spoke. Only the soft murmur of the Atlantic outside broke the silence. Finally, Montholon turned toward them, his expression serene, his voice calm. "We must prepare him. The world will come seeking its answers soon enough." Bertrand met his gaze with a hardness that did not flinch. "And we will ensure they receive the truth, whatever the cost." Montholon offered a slow, measured smile. Of course. But within that smile lurked something darker, an echo of secrets buried deeper than any grave. The day stretched on, grey and hollow, as preparations began for the final chapter of the Emperor's mortal journey. Yet beneath every gesture of mourning, beneath every word of solemn respect, the silent shadow of conspiracy moved like a serpent through the halls of Longwood. The Emperor was dead, but the plots woven around his end were far from finished. The morning sun never truly pierced the thick veil of clouds that hung low over St. Helena on May 7th. A dull, colourless light seeped into the rooms of Longwood House, giving every object, a chair, a mantle, the silent portraits on the walls, a sombre, ghostly pallor. The house, once a reluctant prison, now stood as a mausoleum wrapped in quiet dread. Inside the Emperor's chamber, the air felt leaden, as though time itself pressed down upon the walls. The body of Napoleon Bonaparte lay in repose upon a simple bed, clothed in the green uniform of a colonel of the chasseurs à cheval of the Imperial Guard, his hands crossed upon his chest. The tricolour sash adorned his waist, the star of the Legion of Honour upon his breast. In death, he was dressed as a soldier, a commander of men, rather than a sovereign who had once held the fate of Europe in his hands. Dr. Antommarchi moved with slow, deliberate steps around the room, checking and rechecking the arrangements. His heart thrummed with a nervous disquiet that no measure of clinical detachment could dispel. He had agreed, with visible reluctance, to the autopsy now demanded by Governor Lowe, a procedure that would place the Emperor's remains under the scrutiny of both French companions and British authorities. The thought soured his mouth with a bitterness no words could express. Bertrand stood by the window, gazing out at the low, rolling mists that clung to the hills. His arms were folded across his chest, his expression set in a grim, silent resolve. Though grief clouded his heart, a sharper edge now took shape in his mind, a silent vow forged in the heart of a loyal soldier betrayed by the cold theatre of politics. Montholon entered the chamber quietly, his gloved hands folded neatly before him. His face bore the perfect expression of solemnity, neither too mournful nor too composed. It was the face of a man who understood appearances and the value of seeming grief. "The British physicians will arrive within the hour," Montholon announced softly. "Lowe insists upon it." Antommarchi glanced toward him, the muscles along his jaw tightening. "And you are comfortable with this, Comte? That they will slice into him with the same hands that kept him prisoner?" Montholon offered a slow, measured look. "We must not refuse. The world will demand proof of natural death. Anything less, and we will be accused of hiding the truth." Bertrand turned from the window, his eyes narrowing, or perhaps they wished to erase it. Montholon's brow lifted faintly, a shadow of amusement flickering behind his composed mask. "Perhaps, but we must move carefully. Recklessness now would serve neither his memory nor our safety." Antommarchi felt a cold knot twist in his chest. There was something too rehearsed in Montholon's tone, too smooth in his reason. Yet any protest seemed futile, swallowed by the suffocating web of politics and silent conspiracies that had wrapped itself around them all. By midday, the chamber filled with the quiet bustle of preparations for the post-mortem examination. The British surgeons arrived, Dr. Thomas Short and Dr. Archibald Arnott among them, accompanied by a small retinue of British officers who stood at the edges of the room like silent sentinels. They exchanged curt, professional nods with Antommarchi, who masked his distaste behind a veneer of clinical formality. The proceedings began with meticulous, almost reverent care. The surgeons approached Napoleon's body with the gravity afforded to a fallen sovereign, their hands steady, their faces composed. Yet beneath the surface of this orchestrated professionalism, a deeper current of unease moved, a silent understanding that this autopsy was not merely a medical inquiry, but a political theatre performed for the watching world. Antommarchi remained close, his eyes sharp, his hands gloved. He assisted where required, his every action marked with a precision honed by both his craft and a gnawing need to protect the remnants of the man whose life he had failed to save. Bertrand stood at the foot of the bed, silent and unmoving, his gaze fixed upon the procedure with a soldier's hardened detachment. Yet his heart beat with a storm of restrained fury, each incision, each measured word from the British doctors, a silent affront to the dignity of the man he had followed into exile. Montholon watched from a slight distance, his posture relaxed, his hands folded behind his back. His eyes moved slowly from face to face, observing, cataloguing. There was no sign of grief upon his features, only the composed stillness of a man watching a performance he knew well. As the autopsy progressed, the surgeons worked their way toward the Emperor's stomach, a focal point of interest for Antommarchi, who harboured deep suspicions of foul play. The stomach, so often the seat of Napoleon's mysterious pain, had been the centre of whispered fears, of hushed conversations in the dim corridors of Longwood. When the stomach was finally opened, a strange, leaden silence fell upon the room. Antommarchi leaned forward, his heart pounding. The lining of the stomach revealed extensive damage, ulceration, thickening, and a strange, mottled discoloration unlike anything he had expected. The British doctors exchanged glances, their brows furrowed. "Cancer of the stomach," Dr. Arnott murmured quietly, though his voice carried an uncertain edge. "A malignant ulcer," Short added, his tone equally cautious. Antommarchi stared, his mind racing. Yes, it could explain much, the pain, the wasting, the decline. And yet, the pattern was strange, unnatural. He stepped back, his heart sinking beneath the weight of the unspoken. Montholon approached then, his voice soft, almost soothing. "The cause of death is clear, is it not, gentlemen?" The British doctors nodded slowly, as though compelled by some invisible force of consensus. "Yes," Arnott replied at last. "Stomach cancer." No doubt. Montholon inclined his head, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Then history will have its answer. But in the silent exchange of glances that followed, between Antommarchi, Bertrand, and the British surgeons, a darker truth flickered beneath the surface. A truth they could neither confirm nor deny. The autopsy concluded with solemn efficiency, and the body of the Emperor was prepared for its final rest. Yet in the hearts of those who had stood within that chamber, a different kind of wound remained. One that whispered of betrayals too subtle to expose, and of a death whose secrets would remain shrouded beneath a veil of official declarations. As the day waned, the quiet murmur of the Atlantic continued beyond the walls of Longwood, carrying upon its breath the whispered fragments of a legend, and the silent echoes of a plot that history would forever struggle to unmask. The days following the autopsy passed with the sluggish, heavy march of time thickened by grief and suspicion. St. Helena remained wrapped in its usual damp embrace, the wind moving like a hushed undertone through the hills, as if the island itself mourned, or watched, what unfolded within the walls of Longwood House. Napoleon's body, now prepared for burial, lay in solemn repose within a simple wooden coffin, its interior lined with white satin. His uniform, pristine and untouched since his last breath, remained upon him. The familiar green coat, the sash of the Legion of Honor, the sword resting gently at his side. Upon his face, the cold serenity of death seemed to preserve a final expression, a faint, enigmatic shadow of a smile that none could explain. The chamber had become a shrine of silent reverence. Candles burned softly at each corner of the room, their flames wavering against the long hours of vigil kept by his most loyal followers. Bertrand never left his post near the coffin, his eyes hollow, his presence steadfast as a stone sentry guarding the fallen sovereign. Antommarchi remained close as well, though his heart was less settled. The autopsy's conclusion, stomach cancer, had been accepted without challenge, recorded in official documents by British hands, signed and sealed with all the authority a colonial governor could muster. Yet the doctor's mind remained a tempest of doubt, for the stomach's condition bore strange irregularities, signs that no simple diagnosis could wholly explain. And always, in the background, moved Montholon. With quiet grace and a meticulous attention to every detail, Montholon oversaw the arrangements for the funeral, each gesture cloaked in the reverence of a devoted companion. He coordinated with the British authorities, signed papers, inspected the coffin's preparation, all with a sombre efficiency that earned him soft words of approval from those who saw only the surface of things. But to Bertrand and Antommarchi, his movements seemed too smooth, his demeanour too measured. Grief sat upon him like a garment carefully chosen for the occasion. On the afternoon of May 8th, as a light rain misted over the island, a modest procession formed outside Longwood. French officers and servants assembled in their formal attire, many with eyes rimmed in red from long hours of sleepless mourning. The British contingent stood nearby, Governor Lowe among them, his face expressionless, his uniform as rigid as his posture. The coffin, simple yet dignified, was carried upon the shoulders of French soldiers who had followed Napoleon into exile. Their steps fell in slow, deliberate rhythm upon the damp earth as they began the solemn march toward the Valley of the Willows, the secluded burial site chosen by Napoleon himself, a place he had admired for its tranquil beauty during his long walks in captivity. Bertrand walked beside the coffin, his head held high, his expression a silent testament to unwavering loyalty. Behind him Antommarchi followed, his hands clasped before him, every step weighed with the burden of questions he could not yet voice. And at the rear, moving with practiced composure, came Montholon. The procession wound its way down the narrow, rocky path leading toward the valley. Along the route, islanders gathered in quiet clusters, some bowing their heads, others simply watching in somber silence. No cheers, no cries, only the muted presence of a people bearing witness to the burial of a legend. The Valley of the Willows opened before them like a quiet cathedral of nature. Tall, slender trees bent gently in the breeze, their branches swaying like silent mourners. The chosen gravesite lay beneath a weeping willow, its roots curling softly over the dark, damp earth. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Bertrand stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "Here lies Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, sovereign of men, captive of fate, but never of spirit. His words echoed against the gentle hush of the valley, carried upon the soft wind, settling like a quiet benediction over the grave. Antamaki closed his eyes, listening to the soft thud of earth falling upon the coffin's lid. Each sound seemed to strike a deeper chord within him, a solemn reminder of all that had been lost, and of the truth that might forever remain buried with the man whose legacy would outlive them all. As the final shovel of earth was laid, Montholon stepped forward. He placed upon the grave a small silver cross, a gesture so precise, so deliberate, that even Bertrand felt a chill twist in his heart. "He rests now," Montholon murmured softly, "as he wished." But Antamaki caught a flicker in Montholon's eyes, a glimmer of something not quite sorrow, not quite reverence. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the calm visage of mourning. Yet its brief presence echoed louder than any spoken word. The ceremony concluded with a simple prayer, uttered in hushed Latin by the island's Catholic priest. No fanfare, no grand declarations, just the soft sigh of the wind through the willows and the distant murmur of the Atlantic, as though nature itself bore silent witness to the closing of a chapter that had changed the course of history. As the mourners began to drift away, Bertrand lingered by the grave, his hand resting gently upon the mound of freshly turned earth. Antamaki stood beside him, both men bound by a shared sense of duty and an unspoken resolve. Montholon remained a few steps behind, his expression serene, his eyes watchful. In that quiet valley, beneath the sheltering boughs of weeping willows, Napoleon Bonaparte lay in eternal rest. Yet around his grave swirled the unanswered questions, the unseen hands, and the silent conspiracies that would echo far beyond the lonely cliffs of St. Helena. The emperor's body was buried, but the truth remained untold, wrapped in shadows, waiting for history to uncover its deepest secrets. Night fell upon St. Helena with a hush so profound it seemed to steal the very breath from the land. The valley of the willows lay cloaked in darkness, the soft rustle of leaves stirring in the breeze like whispered farewells to a man whose life had once shaken empires. Beneath the solemn earth, Napoleon rested, his grave marked only by the simple mound, the silver cross glinting faintly in the moonlight. Yet while the island slept, shadows moved beyond the reach of lantern light. Not all who walked the paths of Longwood that night came in mourning. Within the dim confines of a modest chamber adjacent to the main house, Charles Tristan de Montholon sat alone at a narrow writing desk, a single candle casting long shadows across his sharp, angular features. His hands, pale and precise, moved steadily over a sheet of parchment. The lines he penned flowed with the fluid ease of a practiced hand. Not a letter of condolence, nor a tribute to the fallen emperor, but something else entirely. The ink glistened wet beneath his quill as he drafted a report addressed to a name known only to a few within the courts of Europe, a discreet summary of the events leading up to Napoleon's death, veiled in the language of diplomatic courtesy. The matter has concluded without incident. The subject expired on the evening of the 5th. All necessary examinations have been performed. No discrepancies have been noted that would warrant further attention. The governor remains satisfied. The French attendants are contained. The world will be informed in due course that nature fulfilled its role unaided. Montholon paused, his quill hovering mid-air. His lips curled in a faint, knowing smile, one that held neither malice nor pride, but a quiet recognition of a task completed with the precision of a soldier obeying his orders. He sealed the letter with a soft press of wax, imprinting upon it a cipher that would travel not by official channels, but by the hidden veins of the shadowed networks that thrived beneath the surface of European diplomacy. When he rose from his chair, his movements were smooth, unhurried. He extinguished the candle with a soft breath, plunging the room into darkness. Meanwhile, elsewhere within the confines of Longwood, Dr. Francesco Antamaki sat upon a wooden bench in the silent chapel, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The flickering candles along the altar cast long, wavering shadows upon the stone walls. His mind swirled with unanswered questions, each thought a silent echo against the hollow ache in his chest. He had stood beside the emperor in his final hours. He had witnessed the decline, too swift, too unnatural, and had seen the strange mottling of the stomach that defied the textbook descriptions of cancer he knew too well. And yet, the British physicians had been content with their conclusion. Montholon had shown no sign of doubt. The world, so eager to close this chapter, would accept the verdict without question. But Antommarchi could not. As he sat in the chapel, his heart pounded with a silent oath, not to forget, not to allow the truth to vanish beneath layers of official reports and sanitized history. He would speak. When the time was right, he would bear witness to what he had seen, and to what he suspected. A soft footfall stirred behind him. He turned, his eyes narrowing as Bertrand approached, his broad frame casting a dark silhouette against the candlelit wall. "Doctor," Bertrand greeted, his voice low, heavy with unspoken burden. "General," Antommarchi replied, rising slowly. "You couldn't sleep either?" Bertrand shook his head, his face shadowed with grief and something harder, an edge of iron forged in a lifetime of loyalty and war. "I have been thinking," Bertrand said quietly, "about what was said in those final hours." Antommarchi nodded, understanding passing between them in the silent space of shared memory. "He knew," the doctor whispered. "He knew they watched him die." Bertrand's jaw clenched. "And we did nothing." A silence stretched between them, thick with guilt and the oppressive weight of hindsight. Antommarchi placed a hand upon the general's arm. "We were powerless, Henry. The web was spun long before we ever set foot on this cursed island." Bertrand met his gaze, a flicker of pain and resolve passing through his eyes. "Perhaps, but history will not forget us, nor him. We must not allow the silence to become his only legacy." The doctor nodded slowly. "We will bear witness." Outside the chapel, the wind shifted, carrying with it the soft sigh of the Atlantic, the eternal breath of the sea that had cradled the emperor in his exile and now murmured over his grave. Far beyond the island's cliffs, ships moved silently beneath the stars, bearing news of Napoleon's death toward the distant shores of Europe. With them travelled the carefully crafted reports, the diplomatic statements, the narratives forged by men like Lowe and Montholon. But hidden among those vessels was a different message, a whispered truth passed between hands sworn to secrecy, bound by loyalty deeper than fear. And with it, the first faint stirrings of a reckoning that would not be written by governors or conspirators, but by those who had stood by a dying emperor and heard the silent echoes of betrayal in his final breath. The plot had run its course, but its shadow was only beginning to spread. Beneath the pallid glow of waning candlelight, the courtyard lay hushed at the dead hour when the third night after Napoleon's passing slipped into history. The atmosphere was heavy, as if every stone wall and silent arch whispered of secrets too shameful to bear the scrutiny of daylight. In part 19 of this slow and gentle unfolding, the tangled web of deception grows more intimate, more aching with regret and ambition, and more humanly tragical. Here we find ourselves drifting through the corridors of Longwood House, where testimonies of betrayal and loyalty mingle in bitter harmony, and hearts hidden in shadows ache with longing for power or mourning. It is in the eastern wing, seldom visited, that whispers carried on drafty corridors speak of the Duchess of Abrantes, a woman whose devotion to Bonaparte had traversed both fervour and fear. Once a beacon of intimacy and counsel for the emperor, she now stands at the apex of a precarious balancing act, her loyalty tainted by ambitions she once denied. The hush around her is thick, each step muffled on the worn rug leading to a small, lamplit room where she waits. Across the table, the aged Lord Arbuthnot, an exile with a tangled history of alliances, leans forward, his voice low but urgent. "Madame," he begins, voice quivering with both reverence and avarice, "the Emperor is gone. His blood on that strange English soil does not sever our ties. Yet the world watches. They await a sign, an heir, a claim, a metal clasp upon which fate might pivot." His words echo off faded wallpaper, heavily laden with floral motifs that seem to droop in sorrow. "What is your counsel?" The Duchess pauses, fingertips resting upon a brooch, a gift from the Emperor, fashioned from the golden glimmer of Italian craftsmanship. She inhales softly, as though drawing strength from the very air she breathes. "We must act with purpose. If his name and memory are to endure, we must sculpt them into legend. A lineage must appear, something that binds the future to the past. And I hold a fragment of that hope, a secret child, whose very existence is as delicate as gossamer." Lord Arbuthnot's gaze sharpens, both incredulous and staggered with desire. "A child? You claim there is one?" "Yes, Young Antoine, conceived in the fervent nights before Elba, under the starlit canopy of Ajaccio. He is small, unaware, but he has blood of Napoleon. Her admission sends a fresh chill through the room. To place him forward is to command the world's attention. To do nothing is to let the Emperor's spirit die a second death. Outside, the muffled clatter of distant footsteps, guards on watch, perhaps hearing rumour of clandestine whispers. Within, the Duchess lays out a plan. Antoine must be brought from obscurity to prominence. His guardians, humble Corsicans, must be convinced to travel. Letters, forged with deft skill and subtle misdirection, will plead for the boy's transport to France or even Paris, where loyalists may shield him. Then, like a seed sprouting through concrete, he may find roots among the nobility and revolutionaries alike. A new claimant with a flawless narrative, orphan son, rightful heir, embodiment of legacy. How irresistible, to monarchs, to exiles, to republics. Yet she dreads the peril carried by this scheme. Informants lurk in every hearth, French émigrés hungry for favour with the restored Bourbon crown. The slightest slip in her narrative would unleash disorder. If the boy was discovered, the attempt itself becomes treason. The Duchess, a conspirator. Arbuthnot lays crimson-stained fingers across the table, his voice trembling. What of proof? Papers? Witnesses? The Duchess lifts the brooch from its velvet cradle, letting it gleam in candlelight. This, she breathes, came from Napoleon's hand. It was pinned to his coat when he exhaled his final breath. Antoine was born wearing a pendant like this. It can be the key. She lifts her hand, revealing a miniature portrait tucked into a tiny frame. A cherubic, dark-eyed child. Innocence frozen in paint, bearing more resemblance to Josephine than Emperor. Yet the set of his jaw speaks of that iron will, born perhaps of destiny. Arbuthnot studies it, his expression shifting from greed to galvanizing hope. But he also sees the glitter of anguish in the Duchess's eyes. She is haunted by the enormity of what she proposes, to sacrifice her own anonymity, to risk both her life and reputation. Nights ago, or was it days? She lay beside the cold bed where Napoleon had breathed his last, surrendered to grief so absolute it feared no echo. Now she stands on the cusp of scandal, wielding that grief as a blade or a torch. Leaving the whispering sanctum, they decide on immediate action. One courier must slip through the governor's guard, riding north to Jersey, bearing instructions and forged documents. The corsairs, loyal paid hands staked on a promise of future favour, will shepherd Antoine from his island home tucked beneath a merchant's cloak. A falsified death certificate, a new identity, one step closer to the centre of power. Yet that night, as they spoke, footsteps paused at the corridor's mouth. A servant girl, thin and trembling, stands guard by a torch sconce. She bows, uncertain. "Madam, Lord Arbuthnot, they await," she whispers. The Duchess nods, her throat tight. She motions for silence. They slip away like wraiths bound by a bond of defiance and dread. The girl's lamp flickers and winks in the gloom as the distant guards shift in tired diligence. In the hush, the questions rise inaudible but insistent. Will the boy trust them? Will the forged lineage survive scrutiny? What if Bourbon sympathizers sow doubt, brand him an imposter? Will France see in him a spark of redemption or a spark of tyranny? All of this tethers back to the Duchess and her willingness to stake her remaining legacy on a story that crawls with tension, hope and fear. Morning light seeps through narrow windows, finding the Duchess hunched over the table, pen poised above delicate paper. Each word, each signature, a thread woven into a tapestry that wavers between salvation and ruin. She pauses, considering her next phrase in the letter, by order of, in memory of, for the enduring glory of France and of him whom we once called Emperor. And as dawn fractures the darkness, Antoine sleeps on a cradle of rushes miles away, safe for now, yet perched upon a precipice. The game of spies and fate has begun in earnest, and all parties lie in wait. French monarchists, British overseers, loyalists, informants, the silent watchers whose loyalties may shift like sands. The boy's future, and the future of Napoleon's legacy, hang between these tangled loyalties. In that moment, the Duchess allows herself a single breath of longing. The lustre of sacrifice, the burden of hope coalesces in her chest. She closes her eyes, imagine the tiny boy's smile, the curve of his brow, Napoleon's echo. And she prays, in the language of broken hearts and battered ambition, that her actions may one day be believed, that her secret deed to resurrect destiny through a child will not be extinguished. Thus, with trembling resolve, she seals the envelope. Outside, the world hums awake under a cool sky, and inside, the machinery of clandestine salvation begins to whir. We leave her here at the turning point, a woman bound by memory, ambition, grief, poised to shift tides of power with an unseen child. The shadows hold their breath, and the dawn promises both hope and reckoning. In the lingering hush of that fragile dawn, the envelope sealed with trembling hands began its slow, perilous journey beyond the walls of Longwood. The Duchess, having surrendered it to a trusted courier, a wiry Corsican known only as Laurent, watched from the shaded window as he disappeared into the pale morning mist. Her heart beat in a quiet but restless rhythm, like the soft tread of a drum in the distant hills, unseen yet profoundly felt. Yet while the Duchess entrusted her hope to the hands of a loyal messenger, across the narrow seas and beyond the Channel, a different kind of plot simmered in the drawing rooms of London. There, amid tapestries and fine silver, Sir Hudson Lowe, the controversial governor of St. Helena, was embroiled in a tempest of whispered accusations and venomous correspondences. The death of Napoleon had not quelled the fires of conspiracy, it had merely scattered the embers to distant, waiting hands. Sir Hudson, a man both reviled and lauded in equal measure, sat before a cluster of sealed reports, their wax bearing the insignias of foreign ministries and shadowy committees. His thin lips tightened as he read, his pale fingers brushing lightly over the parchment. The accusations were sharp, the implications sharper still. France had begun to stir in hushed salons and dimly lit cafes, murmuring that Napoleon had not succumbed to mere illness. Some whispered of poison, a slow, creeping venom fed to him in water, in wine, perhaps in his ink or the very walls of his chamber. Others spun darker tales of secret assassins, of invisible hands sanctioned by London, or even by Bourbon France itself. Sir Hudson pressed his temples, his mind wrestling with a flood of memories. The Emperor's drawn face, his laboured breath in those final weeks, the strange decay of his vigour. Was it merely the stomach malady of which the physicians spoke, or had he unknowingly been complicit in a deeper plot? A thought he could neither banish nor fully believe took root, a notion that chilled even his seasoned heart. The documents before him hinted at more than mere rumour. Enclosed within the dispatch from a Prussian envoy were extracts from intercepted letters between French royalist exiles and shadowy English merchants, men whose wealth and influence allowed them to move unseen. The words danced before his eyes. Ensure that the exile of Longwood remains a chapter closed. No martyrdom, no second rise. The world cannot afford a legend. A tremor coursed through Sir Hudson's hand. The gravity of the implications turned the air in the chamber thin and metallic. Could it be? Could the mighty Emperor, once the terror of Europe, have been quietly extinguished by the very men who guarded him? Or had fear twisted truth into lies, fashioning conspiracies where only coincidence lay? He thought back to Dr. O'Meara, the Irish physician once loyal to Napoleon, whose own fall from grace had been as swift as it was mysterious. Dr. O'Meara's dismissal, his veiled warnings of foul play, his cryptic reports to the British Admiralty, they now seemed less like the ravings of a disgraced servant and more like fragments of a larger, darker tapestry. Could O'Meara have seen something others missed? Had the seeds of a quiet assassination been planted in the very soil Sir Hudson tended? Haunted by this gnawing dread, Sir Hudson summoned his aide, a young officer named Rivington, whose loyalty was as fresh as his commission. The man entered briskly, though his eyes betrayed a trace of unease. "Sir?" he asked, his voice taut with the uncertainty that hung between them. Sir Hudson gestured to the reports. "These? They speak of poison. They speak of plots behind our own backs. I want every record, every physician's note, every servant's testimony reviewed. Quietly, discreetly. If this has been done under our watch, I intend to know. And I intend to bury it before the world does." Rivington bowed, yet a shadow crossed his features. "And if we find evidence, sir? What then?" A long silence lingered in the chamber. Sir Hudson's eyes drifted toward the window, where the grey skies of London pressed heavily against the glass. "Then we pray it never sees light," he said softly, "for if it does, neither Crown nor Parliament shall escape the stain." As the aide departed, his footsteps faded into the thick carpets, leaving Sir Hudson alone with his storm of unspoken fears. Yet even as the governor tried to command the whirlwind, elsewhere in London, darker currents stirred. Within a narrow townhouse on Charles Street, the Marquess of Hertford, a man whose connections extended from royal chambers to the darkest corners of espionage, entertained a guest whose name would not appear in any official register. This visitor, known among certain circles as the Black Pen, had long served as a silent hand for political subterfuge. The Marquess poured a measure of fine cognac, his hand steady as the visitor spoke in low, deliberate tones. "The rumours in Paris grow wilder each day," the Black Pen murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "There is talk not only of poison, but of orchestrated silence. They whisper that even you, my lord, had a hand in ensuring the Emperor's demise, that you stood to gain with his death." The Marquess offered a thin smile, eyes gleaming with the cool sharpness of a practiced conspirator. "Let them whisper. The dead cannot speak, and the living dare not. As long as the papers hold no proof, words are wind." "But," the Black Pen countered, leaning in, "if a child exists, a living heir, if the Duchess succeeds." The Marquess's smile faded. "Then we shall ensure he does not." With those words, an invisible line was drawn across the continent. The race to control the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte, to either crown his memory or crush it beneath the boot of treachery, had begun in earnest. The Duchess's fragile plan, carried on the back of a single courier, now teetered on the brink of exposure. And lurking in the shadows, men of ambition and dread prepared to wield blade, ink or coin to silence it forever. That very night, as Laurent pressed through the mists of the Channel, shadowed by ships whose purpose he could only guess, the cold hands of a new conspiracy began to close around him. The dirtiest plots of the Emperor's death had not ended with his final breath. They had merely shifted shape, grown darker, and seeped into the veins of Europe itself. And as a soft drizzle fell over the cobblestones of London, Sir Hudson sat with his pen poised, a man haunted by questions he dared not answer. The shadows lengthened, the chessboard lay set, and the dead Emperor's legacy stood upon a knife's edge, balanced between truth and oblivion. The fog hung low over the Channel, swallowing the horizon in a cold, silent shroud as Laurent urged his steed along the winding coastal road. Each hoofbeat echoed faintly in the damp air, a solemn percussion that seemed to announce both hope and impending peril. The missive he carried, a fragile tether to the Duchess's daring scheme, lay pressed against his chest beneath layers of coarse cloth. Its presence was a weight heavier than gold, a silent heartbeat of destiny that pulsed with every stride. Behind him, the faint glimmer of a lantern bobbed along the road. A carriage, perhaps, or a solitary traveller braving the morning gloom. Yet Laurent, whose instincts had been sharpened on the perilous trade routes of Corsica, sensed the shadow in pursuit was no mere coincidence. He leaned forward, murmuring soft encouragement to his horse, urging it gently toward a thicket where the road dipped into a hollow. The wind sighed through the brambles as he dismounted, pulling his cloak tighter. He crouched behind a twisted oak, ears straining for the faintest sound. Their hoofbeats, deliberate and measured, a single rider following at a distance too calculated for comfort. Laurent's fingers brushed the hilt of the slender dagger at his waist, the cold steel a comfort against the rising chill within him. Minutes passed, slow and syrupy, before the rider emerged into view, a tall figure clad in a dark riding coat, face obscured by the tilt of a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger halted at the hollow's edge, scanning the road with a stillness that betrayed both discipline and intent. Laurent's breath caught. This was no wandering traveller. The man remained astride his horse, unmoving, as though waiting for Laurent to reveal himself. A silent standoff stretched between them, brittle as glass. Then, as if resigned, the stranger turned slowly, his horse stepping lightly back toward the main road. Laurent watched until the figure dissolved into the fog, swallowed by the morning mist. Only when the faint echo of hooves vanished entirely did he rise, heart pounding in his ears. He dared not delay. The game had begun in earnest, and his part in it was far from over. That same morning, far across the sea, the Duchess of Abrantes sat once more at her writing desk, her hands steady despite the torrent of unease beneath her composed exterior. News had reached her, through the whispered corridors of Longwood, that her movements were under scrutiny. The governor's guards watched with eyes sharpened by suspicion. Idle servants whispered in corners. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the murmur of betrayal. Yet it was not fear that filled her thoughts as she penned a second letter. It was purpose. This letter, unlike the clandestine missive borne by Laurent, was meant for an entirely different recipient, a woman whose loyalty was beyond question, though her presence remained hidden from the eyes of the world. Marie-Louise, once Empress of the French, now a widow by all reckonings of state, lived in Parma under the suffocating gaze of Austrian oversight. Yet within her heart, the embers of an old, forbidden love for Napoleon flickered, dimmed, but not extinguished. The Duchess's hand moved in delicate strokes, weaving words of quiet urgency and veiled entreaty. She wrote not as a conspirator, but as a friend, a fellow soul entwined by the shared grief of a man whose death shook empires. In careful phrases she hinted at the existence of a child, Antoine, the flickering hope of a legacy neither crown nor court could erase. She invoked memories of happier times, of the Emperor's whispered promises, of Marie-Louise's own role in shaping the heart of an empire. She asked for nothing overt, only understanding, only silent support. The quiet readiness to shelter the embers of a hope that the world believed extinguished. As the ink dried on the parchment, the Duchess allowed herself a fleeting vision, a dream of the Empress's hand shielding the boy, of Austrian palaces turned into sanctuaries, of alliances forged in quiet defiance of kings. It was a fragile dream, perhaps a foolish one. But in this intricate web of plots and counterplots, even a whisper of hope carried the weight of destiny. Unbeknownst to her, as the letter was sealed and prepared for its hidden courier, Marie-Louise herself sat in the gilded solitude of her Parma estate, eyes lingering on a portrait of the Emperor rendered in softer times. The flicker of memory stirred something deep within, a longing, a wound, a dormant ember waiting for breath. While the Duchess wove her silent appeals and Laurent risked his life upon the misty roads, within London's most guarded circles, the storm of conspiracy gathered new force. The Black Pen, known to none by his true name, crossed the threshold of a house in Whitehall under the cover of dusk. The Marquis of Hertford awaited him, a silent sentinel amid the polished darkness of the study. Their conversation unfolded like the silent opening of a venomous bloom. "The courier was sighted near Dover," the Black Pen whispered, his voice a mere thread in the shadowed room. "The Corsican. He carries the seed of this false heir. Do we strike?" The Marquess leaned back, fingers steepled. "Not yet. We follow. Let him reach France if he must. The child, the letters, none of it matters if we know every hand that touches them. Better to see the roots before cutting the tree. But if word reaches Vienna, Parma." The Marquess smiled, thin as a blade. "Then we remind the Austrian court of their precarious peace. We whisper of scandal, of unrest, of Napoleonic embers fanned by treachery. Fear is a finer blade than any assassin's dagger." The Black Pen nodded, vanishing into the folds of the night as a servant entered with a tray of brandy, oblivious to the silent war waged within the heart of the Empire. And so, even as Laurent pressed on through damp fields and shadowed woods, believing himself hunted only by nameless pursuers, the trap wove tighter with every mile. The Duchess, unaware of the true depth of the plot against her, continued her dance upon a razor's edge. And across Europe, hearts and hands moved according to their silent loyalties, some to the ghost of an emperor, others to the iron grip of a world desperate to forget him. In this delicate balance of shadows and whispers, the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte became a silent storm, gathering in secret chambers and across lonely roads, beneath gilded ceilings and in forgotten forests. Every letter, every whispered word, every footstep upon foreign soil wove into a tapestry none could yet see in full. And somewhere upon that vast unseen loom, destiny waited, its thread spun by hands both loyal and treacherous, its pattern glimpsed only in the dark spaces between hope and ruin. Night fell over the northern reaches of France, with a softness that belied the silent war threading through its heart. Under a sky veiled in silver clouds, Laurent rode through a dense stretch of forest near Rouen, the air damp with the scent of moss and autumn leaves. His cloak, heavy with the chill of the sea air he had crossed, clung close around him as he guided his weary mount along a hidden path known only to smugglers and wandering friars. Each beat of the horse's hooves echoed in Laurent's ears like a distant drum, a reminder of how fragile the line was between mission and demise. The letter from the Duchess remained secure within the folds of his tunic, its fragile weight a constant presence against his heart. It was not merely ink upon paper he carried. It was a seed of upheaval, a whisper meant to outlive empires. But Laurent's solitude was not destined to last. As he approached a narrow bridge spanning a slow, black river, the soft murmur of voices reached him, a sound muffled by the forest's hush but distinct in its cadence. He drew his horse to a halt, sliding silently to the earth as the wind teased at the edges of his cloak. The voices were ahead, beyond the curve of the path. Men, 2, perhaps 3. Their tone was low, purposeful, bearing the unmistakable weight of men, discussing deeds that could not withstand the scrutiny of daylight. Laurent's hand drifted once more to the dagger at his waist. He crept forward, feet finding purchase on the soft earth, breath shallow as a hunter's. There, beneath the bowing limbs of a beech tree, stood 2 figures cloaked in dark riding garb, their horses tethered to the bridge rail. One man traced a finger over the map spread upon a saddle, speaking in clipped French laced with the faintest trace of English accent. He rides tonight, alone, the Corsican. Our orders are to intercept, search, and relieve him of his burden. No blood unless necessary. The Marquess wishes him silenced by fear, not by force. The second man grunted, a brutish sound of agreement. And if he resists, a pause. Then you do what must be done, but leave no trace. The roads are thick with royalist patrols. We cannot risk exposure. Remember, the boy's existence must remain a whisper, if it must remain at all. Laurent swallowed hard, a cold band tightening around his chest. They were hunting him. They had known his path, his purpose. The noose was drawing tight, and now it hung but a whisper's breadth from his throat. For a fleeting moment, Laurent considered retreat. Melt back into the shadows, abandon the bridge, the path, perhaps even the mission. But as the thought flickered, another surged in its place. A memory, fierce and uncompromising, of the Duchess's eyes, of her trembling hands pressing the letter into his care. The hope of a broken empire, the fragile future of a child, depended upon the thin thread of his resolve. He stepped back, heart thundering, and retraced his silent path to his horse. With a swift, silent motion, he mounted once more and turned toward a path less travelled, a narrow deer trail veering east through the thickening wood. He urged the steed into motion, branches clawing at his cloak as he pressed deeper into the night, the whisper of pursuers close upon the wind. Hours bled into one another as Laurent navigated a labyrinth of forgotten byways, the spectre of capture pressing upon his every step. His mind raced with silent prayers, with the fevered hope that the letter would outpace the web of betrayal closing in around him. The dirt-streaked horizon began to soften with the hues of dawn when he glimpsed at last the spires of Seine in the distance. He did not slow until his horse shuddered beneath him, foaming at the mouth, its flanks heaving with exhaustion. Laurent dismounted at the edge of a quiet village, his limbs trembling as though the shadows themselves clawed at his heels. He left the horse tethered by a silent chapel and pressed on foot through the narrow streets toward the house of an old ally, a Corsican trader known as Deleuze, a man who trafficked not only in goods but in secrets. The door answered his knock with the slow, wary creak of suspicion. Deleuze, a man of stocky build and wary eyes, stared from the threshold. Recognition flickered in his gaze, followed by something sharper, a shared understanding of the peril woven into Laurent's every breath. Inside. "Quickly," Deleuze murmured. The door closed upon the dawn just as 3 riders appeared at the village edge, silent watchers whose eyes combed the narrow streets with the patience of wolves. Within the house's stone walls, Laurent unfolded the letter, hands trembling as he pressed it into Deleuze's care. "You must deliver this to Paris," Laurent whispered. "No delays, no questions. It reaches the hands of Marceau at the Rue Saint-Denis. He will know what to do." Deleuze nodded once, solemn and sharp. "It will be done." And with that, the burden passed from Laurent's weary hands to another link in the fragile chain of hope, a chain now stretched thin across the breadth of France, woven through hands loyal and treacherous alike. As dawn broke fully upon the land, casting long shadows across ancient stones and weary hearts, the conspiracy stirred anew. In Paris, whispers of a child born of the emperor began to seep into salons and secret chambers, Letters, unsigned but unmistakable in their purpose, reached men and women whose hearts had never relinquished the dream of empire. In Vienna, an unsigned note found its way to the Empress's chambers, its words wrapped in veiled appeal and unspeakable risk. And far away, upon the wind-swept cliffs of St. Helena, the Duchess of Abrantes stood at the edge of the sea, eyes fixed upon the horizon, where hope had vanished with the sails of a departing ship. She felt the weight of every heartbeat, every breath that might yet ripple into history's tide. Behind her, the shadows of treachery and loyalty coiled together in a silent, unseen dance. The dirtiest plots born in the shadow of Napoleon's death had not faded with his final breath. They thrived, unseen and relentless, in the spaces between empire and exile, between love and ambition, between memory and legend. And as Europe stirred in uneasy slumber, the embers of a legacy not yet dead began to smoulder anew, carried in whispered words, in secret letters, and in the beating heart of a child destined to either claim or be claimed by the cruel hands of fate.